Welcome to this video. We're going to be checking out three-part counterpoint away from the species approach and also away from that whole note cantus firmus. So if you watch my other three-part counterpoint videos, that's going to help you understand what's going on here. This is actually going to be a rescore of a teaching piece that was written by Gareth Green. And this was on the Music Matters YouTube channel. I'm going to link the original video down below so you can check that out. I made sure to write down notes of everything he talks about in the video, so I'm definitely going to mention all of that, and then on top of that, I'm also going to mention all of the notes that he added, and break it down, and we're going to see, okay, is he writing notes that fit in a chord, maybe they don't fit in a chord, and they're passing tones or something like that, and from the simple piano line that you see written, it's going to further develop into a string trio, to where this actually uses 2 violins and a cello. So if you're not used to reading the alto clef, this is going to be pretty easy for you. And this video will have 3 major parts through it. It's going to have the beginning, where we're just going to analyze the theme, kind of make sense of it. Then we're going to go into the next part, where we're going to see where the theme has been placed throughout the 3 instruments, the violin 1, violin 2, and the cello. The same theme is going to be placed throughout the different voices. It might be placed in its entirety to where you get this whole thing. It might be a slight variation of this, or it may just be a part of this phrase that you see here and not actually the whole entire thing. After that part 2, we're going to move on to part 3, where we're actually going to see all of the other notes filled in that are going to make the piece finalized. And when we get into analyzing part 3, we are going to already have made sense of the basis from part 2 of where everything was placed. So now when it's placed in part 3, we're just going to connect more dots and furthermore interpret the notes that he wrote. Okay, so we're just going to first listen to all 3 of those, starting with the simple piano phrase, and then we're going to listen to how that is placed throughout the 3 different instruments. After that, then we're going to listen to the final response. Then we're going to get into analyzing everything, and after we analyze each of those 3 sections, I'm going to play it for you again. So now that we actually understand what's going on, we're going to listen to it a second time. Okay, so now let's give each of these a listen. Okay, here we are back at the piano phrase, which can be known as the theme. Of course, the theme can be longer and more complex than this, but this serves as a simple theme that can be very easy to follow and also spot throughout the piece. Also, as you saw, it's not very long of a piece. It's only measures long, but it has some good, interesting moments, involvement with the instruments, and also a nice ending, a nice cadence. And although it kept with the same basic melody like we saw with the second part, where basically it was just in the different instruments, you didn't have all the other notes filled in yet, it still was not all that boring. It had some interest to it. And why is this? One of the main reasons has to do with the modulations. The same musical phrase is not just being repeated in the same notes in the same key, just in different instruments. In fact, it's using completely different notes, but those notes have the same relationship to the key and the chords of that key that the phrase did from the beginning. So it holds that sort of structure, which adds to a familiarity while you're listening to it and creates a sort of musical structure. But then the modulations make it so it's a little different every time, and you're actually hearing different notes. And if you paid attention, it modulated quite a lot, which we're going to go over all the modulations in a second here, but it's good to comprehend, and we'll see that although it modulates quite a lot, that it has a nice sound to it and actually just adds to the interest. So this was a great learning lesson for me, because in the past I always thought, well, I don't want to modulate too much because I don't want the listener to lose track, not know which key they're in and get confused. But from listening to this response and seeing how much it modulated, it made me realize that the listener doesn't always have to hear exactly, okay, I'm in this key and I'm going to that key. When it's well written, it is a nice musical experience. And oftentimes a lot of people aren't hearing it's in this key or it's in that key. They're just listening to the piece as it is. And if you do everything smoothly, like we'll see some pivot chords and some pivot notes, stuff like that, we're going to see smooth transitions between different keys. And all that it's going to do is play off the expectations as well as throwing off those expectations and creating that musically. Okay, so now let's analyze this phrase so we're familiar with it. This might sound familiar if you know your J.S. Bach solo violin works, specifically the partitas and specifically partita 3. I luckily have a personal copy here at home, and if we compare the very beginning of the partita 3, we see the first 6 notes are identical. So that's why when you hear the beginning, it might be like, oh, that sounds familiar, or maybe you might think, oh, it sounds like J.S. Bach's partita number 3. Well, it's very similar. The next beat is very similar to what Bach wrote as well, but this is based off the chord built on the 5th degree of the scale, while Bach's phrase was built on the tonic still. So very similar to the beginning of Bach's partita number 3. So I don't know if Gareth was influenced by Bach or if he just wrote it and it turned out similar, because we'll see that what is written very well could have been written without the influence of Bach, but it being so strikingly similar, and especially with similar note durations as well, makes me think that there's some inspiration here, which I see as an incredible thing, being inspired by J.S. Bach. Whatever it is, we'll see that he chose to do an anacrusic start, which just uses the tonic, and then it goes to the 7th degree. And I have these Roman numerals labeling the chords here, and this isn't saying that you have to use Roman numerals when using counterpoint. A lot of people actually say you should not. And think of this more as a placeholder to help you understand what's going on with the phrase. We're also going to be thinking about chords here, so we're going to be thinking about tonal counterpoint in this video. So we're not going to be putting a ton of Roman numerals, but we're going to keep the basic phrase showing that it goes 1, 5, 1, and you're going to see that throughout the piece displayed. So you'll just be able to comprehend that simple relationship between those chords. Of course, putting different notes under and around the notes in the phrase could alter these chords that we have already, but it's the fact that this basic phrase is built off these chords. So we have chord 1 in the first phrase. So in the key signature, we see 1 sharp here. See, it's on the note F, so that tells us we're in the key of G major. If you have trouble understanding keys and key relationships, then I'll link a video in the description that'll help you understand that. Okay, so now we know we're in G major. We see that we start with the anacrusic start of G going to F. It's not really saying it's chord 1 or anything, but if you could say what's it based off, well, it's based off the tonic note G, which then has the lower neighboring tone of the F, which we see goes right back up to the G starting on the first measure. So I put that 1 there because it's based off the 1. Next, we see an actual tonic chord spelled out. So if we think about the tonic chord of G major, we think G, B, D, and that is the triad. Of course, we could add the F if we're thinking about a 7th chord, but here we're thinking about simple triads. So we see a G goes down to a D, then goes down to a B. Okay, so you see G, B, D spelt out plain and simple there. It's descending. Instead of going G, B, D, it goes G, D, B. So it's still spelling out the chord. So it goes 1, 5, 3. After that, you go up to a C, which just serves as a passing tone, bridging you from the B to the D. And it's not only occurring on a weak beat of beat 2, but it's occurring on the and of beat 2. So even a weaker part of the weak beat. Here we're in a 3/4 time, so we actually have a strong beat on beat 1, and then we have 2 weak beats after that. Okay, so since that was a passing tone that didn't function as a chord tone in the tonic chord of the notes G, B, and D, it's a C, so it's a non-chord tone, it's a dissonant passing tone. And it's a good tip to try to write dissonances when you can in counterpoint. And when I'm saying when you can, that's just within the sort of rules that they give you. And the rules of counterpoint aren't so much to confine you. They're more so to give you a basic set of ideas to give you the end product that you're actually looking for. So it's more of a help than a hinder. Of course, you can overuse things and use things in the wrong way. Okay, so moving on to the next chord, we have chord 5 of G major. So it's going to be D. And again, if anything, we're just going to have a triad. You're going to see here, we just have the note D, which steps up to the note E, goes back to the note D. So E obviously isn't in the chord, so it's just an upper neighboring tone. Then from the second D here, it goes down to a C. C is just acting as a passing tone. Again, it doesn't fit in that chord. That bridges us to chord 1 though, again. Then we're back at chord 1 again. We see the note B, goes to A, G, back up to A. And again, chord 1 being G, B, D, we could see that ending on the A here leaves us saying, okay, where are we gonna go? Because it's not ending on a chord tone. So this has to be responded to somehow, which looking how it's going from the B, a chord tone, to the A non-chord tone, a passing tone, back to a G, which is another chord tone. Then from there, as it's going back up to the A, it looks like it's gonna go in that direction. So we might expect it to act as a passing tone. So it's always good to pay attention to where a melody looks like it wants to go as you're writing, because we can see an overall shape to the melody as we follow it. It starts off going down a little bit and it goes back up, but then we see a nice overall swoop going down, has a sort of wave going back up, and then the wave sort of dips back down. So we can expect that wave to go back up now. We can also analyze a simple harmonic rhythm here in this phrase. As we can see, there's beat 1 on the first 2 beats, and then beat 5 is on the third beat. Being 3/4, that's also the last beat of the measure. So you have 2 beats in chord 1, 1 beat in chord 5, leading you on to chord 1 again. This is a very common thing to do in a 3/4 time, and it's also a good idea, because you're not just doing one chord throughout an entire measure, but instead you have a chord that sort of grounds you in the first 2 beats, and then the third beat sort of lifts you off to somewhere else or bridges you off to somewhere else, leading you back on those first 2 beats again, or just on the first beat again. And now if we think about those chords that we're using and we think about, okay, so what are these notes highlighting in that chord? We'll see the anacrusic start begins on the tonic, which then forms a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighboring note, which goes back up to the tonic again. So if we're thinking about chord 1, we see how we had the tonic, and then we had the 7th, and then we went back up to the tonic again. So we got a little taste of the 7th degree there. Having the tonic go down to the 7th and back up to the tonic is probably not hinting at a 7th chord or anything like that, but it's simply showing you the leading tone, which furthermore could be developed with notes below and above it. But for now, it's simply just functioning as a leading tone. Then we kind of already went over this, but since we have chord 1, which in G major is G, B, D, and we go G, D, B, we'll see the first note, the G, goes down to the D, the 5th, and then that goes down to B, the 3rd. From B, it just goes up a step, so that's just the 4th. But again, that is a dissonant passing tone. And again, here in counterpoint, we're thinking about fourths as dissonances. When we're thinking about them as an interval, or here we're actually thinking about it within a chord and its relationship to that chord tone. Being a root position, you have a 1, 3, and a 5, so that 4 is just a dissonant note in there. And of course, you can have leaps of a fourth, because that's different than intervals or how it's relating to a chord. It's just a leap. You don't know exactly what note or interval that's going to create technically with a leap. So leaps of fourths are fine, but treating the fourth as a dissonance is very important here, because when you get into invertible counterpoint and you want to invert at certain intervals, then it matters which note you're treating a certain way. So in the case of invertible counterpoint at the octave, you actually want to treat fourths as dissonances. And having that as sort of a base of counterpoint, you're already treating your fourths as your dissonances in your chords and in your intervallic relationships, unless they're justified in certain ways. This is going to help you invert that melody. And if you're writing a 2-part piece or 2-part counterpoint to where you have, let's say, a bass line and then a soprano line above that, and you're starting with a solid bass line and a nice melody above that. It's a very good solid way to start a piece or an idea. And now in that case, instead of just thinking of fourths in your chord, in your chord tones, which chord you're using, but you're thinking about your intervals, now you're going to be able to flip those two things, where you're going to be able to put the bass in the top line and the melody in the bottom line, or whatever you do, you're going to be able to put one below the other. So whichever voices either of those end up, you could even now have the original soprano now acting as a tenor line and the original bass line now acting as an alto line with different parts around that. Okay, so that's why it's very important to treat the fourth as a dissonance, because you can do all sorts of invertible counterpoint at the octave. The approach that Gareth chose here is actually a lot more free. He just wrote a simple melody, and he's writing that melody in many different parts, and then he's writing other parts responding to that melody. And he has a structure, a formula, a way that he's actually completing this that allows it to have familiarization, as well as throwing you off from the parts that you familiarize with and bring you into some unexpected territories. But basically everything is based on stuff that you previously heard, or if not, you're going to hear it again at some point, which will further reinforce it. And we're going to go through all that in the video. Okay, so before moving on to part 2, it's good to think about when we're using these passing tones, neighboring tones, and these dissonant devices like a dissonant suspension, could this also be implying something? We see, for example, here in the first measure, we're not going to count the acoustic start as the first measure, but instead we're going to count this as the first measure. If we look at the third beat of the first measure, here are the 16th notes, we would see the passing tone of the 7th and how it's going to imply the 5-7 chord. Of course, right now it's very plain and there aren't the other notes in the chord, but labeling it as the 5th chord of the scale that we're using will allow us to then fill in those other notes, completing the chord, as well as give us a basis from where we're working. So we're not just blindly putting in notes, but instead we see that we're putting in notes that are corresponding to this chord here, which is the 5th degree of the chord. Now, some people might argue not to use Roman numerals, and that's perfectly fine, but in that case, we could just be thinking about these chords as the chord themselves. So instead of thinking about the relationship of the 5th degree of the scale that we're using, we could just simply think that, okay, we're using a G chord here, and then we're using a D chord here. And then we could also think that the whole time we're in G major, because the only accidentals that we have are F sharp. So you could think about it in that way if you want to. But again, these Roman numerals are more acting as a note and a placeholder telling us what other notes to put below and around this. Okay, so now that we're familiar with this melodic phrase, let's listen to this and then we'll move on. Okay, so now we're on part 2 to where we're actually putting that theme into different parts and different instruments and also in different keys. So we're going to go over in this part how it modulates with the simple melody that we had. I'm not going to be numbering all the numbers throughout this. We're just going to be looking at the notes and the chords and stuff like that, passing tones, because it'll get a lot more confusing if I start writing all the numbers. But for this, we've got a brief understanding of what's going on within these chords and how the melody is highlighting the chords. So we see violin 1 takes the theme. It starts with the anacoustic start, just like was written. That takes us through the first measure and then through the first beat of the next measure where we left off. And now we can interpret what happened from here. It's good to note that this is going to act as a bridge from G, the key that we're in, to the key of D major. So when I don't write G major, D major, I just write G or D, it's major. If it was minor, then I'll write minor. Okay, so again, remember we left off on this A here, and we see that goes up to B, that goes up to C sharp, which C sharp is the note that's telling us that now we're in D major. We don't have C sharp in G major, we only have F sharp. And then we see this lands to the D and then goes down to a B, which takes us back up to a C, which goes back up to a G, F, and then E. So if we're thinking about chords there, then that first one having the B and the D highlighted back down to the B with that leap between the D and the B makes me think it's just a B chord. So it's good to think major and minor and such, but oftentimes in counterpoint, you're not going to be treating major or minor much differently, just based on the fact that you have, let's say, a major or minor third interval. when you're dealing with things like repeated tones and you're thinking chord to chord and stuff like that, okay, things might change. But the point is, when you're writing a melodic line like this, you're not really thinking about, okay, is this highlighting a major third or minor third? Am I going to treat it differently because of that? We're just treating these intervals and these chord tones depending on how they relate to the key, to the chord, with things like the chord tones, passing tones, and stuff like that. So that looks like it's highlighting a B chord, which if we thought further about it and we thought, okay, we're going to be in D major now, and we know we already have F sharp, and we now have C sharp, then if we spelt out the B chord, then we'd have B, D, and F sharp spelled out as a root position triad. So that'll help us when we think about what notes we want to add and making sure that we're adding the correct notes. And most likely we're just going to be thinking about, okay, we're in the key of D and we want a B chord. Then we're going to write a B chord and we're going to write the accidentals in the key of D, which is F sharp and C sharp. I think that's more of the natural way, or at least that's naturally how I do it more, instead of breaking it down and dissecting it like I explained in the beginning. Okay, so now we go on to the third beat, and we see the notes C, G, which looks like a passing tone of an F, and then an E, so C, E, G, we could see that would be a C chord. Okay, so now we have that bridge from G to D, and now what we see here might look like the beginning of the anacroustic start, and that's because it is. So in violin 1, where these last two notes are leaving off from this theme, from this phrase, we have the beginning of the theme or phrase now in a different key in violin 2. And I was mentioning that I'm going to analyze the notes that were written, so let's start doing this right here. Starting off in the new key, we see that we have a D and a C sharp. The D is acting, of course, as the tonic, and the C sharp is acting as the seventh. I'm not going to label a bunch of intervals, but I just want you to see the fact that, okay, the same thing is happening. It's the same relationship of notes now to a different key. Okay, so the same relationship of notes helps to add the familiarity of the placement of notes in the key, and being in a different key also adds more interest now and makes it a little different. We know that we're working with these last two notes against these last two notes, so let's see what we're creating here. First, we'll analyze the ending of the phrase for violin 1, and we'll look at this last beat here. So we see we have the C and the G, so those are going to be acting as our chord tones. Again, the F is acting as a passing tone, and then the E is acting as a chord tone. I'm mentioning this again because this is a little different, how below this we have a D. The D is acting as the tonic, okay, and those are acting at the same time. So below you have the D, and above that you have the F, because it's acting as a passing tone in this circumstance up here. So we have D, and we have F, creates a simple third. And we'll know one thing that's good in counterpoint is consecutive thirds and sixths. While on the other hand, you don't want the parallel fifths and octaves. So here we actually see some consecutive thirds. And that's because we see the bottom voice is moving down a step and the top voice is moving down a step. They were both creating thirds before, so we automatically know they're both creating thirds now, but we can easily see the bottom voice has the C sharp and the top voice has the E. Again, this is telling us that C chord or C sharp chord. So we're thinking about those chord tones of C, E, and G. Now we see we actually went to a chord tone on the bottom. We have the C sharp. And above that now, we also have a chord tone of E. So it's interesting how this all functions, because originally the melody was functioning as the tonic, and then it goes down to the 7th degree with that neighboring tone. And of course that's still happening here in the key of D, but now it's functioning differently, because instead of just functioning as the tonic and what could be the leading tone, well, now we see a C sharp with an E above it. And those are both in the context of this melody here that is just highlighting the chord of C sharp. Okay, so it's a little different how that all played out there, but we see it all worked with having the third and then also creating the parallel thirds, and then it actually ended up sort of resolving because we have the C sharp with the E. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next line. We see violin 2. We see the same thing. Now we're in D major. We already had the anacroustic start, and now we have the first two beats, which is the chord 1. Then we have the third beat, chord 5, which then takes us on to the next section where we have chord 1 on that first beat, and then we have the bridge, which takes us from D to G. We see something almost identical to what we had above, but it's slightly different in the end. Similarly, in this second measure here on beat 2, we're going up 3 steps, and then we leap down a third. We go up another step, and then here's where things get different. Instead of leaping up a 5th and then going down 2 steps like we did above. Now we're just going up a fourth and we're going down 2 steps. This is something that you see Bach doing a lot, where he creates a sort of phrase and he creates a very small variation within it. With this small variation, he then normally plays off this throughout the piece, whether that's slowly making it smaller and smaller or doing something else that's clever, shifting other notes slightly, maybe just one note at a time. We'll see how that plays out here with what Gareth did. Okay, so almost identical melody here compared to above, now in D major, just with that slight variation in that last beat of the second measure there. We already talked about what the notes are doing. I highlighted it before, so we already know what it's doing. Doing the same thing in D, and now we have that bridge from D to G. So let's look at what's happening here. Okay, so starting the second measure, same thing, but now in D. We have F, E, D, going back up to E. The D and the F are acting as the chord tones. The E is acting as a passing tone in both circumstances. The E takes us to an F again, which here we're going to be looking at the bridge. From F we go G up to A, then back down to F. So we see pretty clearly highlighted F and A, just with the G passing tone in the middle. Okay, so again, I didn't label this. We're not really thinking about this as chord 3 in D major. We very well could be. What we are thinking here is now we're in D major and we're building an F chord. That's what we're working with here. Okay, and for now this is just an implied F chord because we just have the F and the A. We're going to add some more notes later that are going to actually fill in the full chord. So right now when I'm saying this looks like a F chord, well it could, but let's say we added a D below it, now it would be a D chord, D, F, and A, okay? So we're going to see how this all plays out, just analyzing it for now. And we see that from the F, we're going on to the next beat now with these 4/16 notes. G goes up to C, goes down to B, and then to A. This next part looks more like a melodic line than something that's actually highlighting a chord. We could try to think about what chord this is making out, or we could just think of it like it is a note that leaps up a fourth and then goes down 2 steps. Different people will definitely look at this in different ways. For me, if I wanted to make a chord out of this and say what chord would this be implying for me, with a leap from G to C, I would be thinking about those 2 notes being highlighted the most, and I would be thinking, okay, it's probably highlighting a C chord, where you have the C and the G, you don't have the E. And then as it goes down here, I would just think of this as stepwise motion that's either leading you back to the G, or it's leading you somewhere else, but it looks like it's leading somewhere. It doesn't look like at the end of this it's completing what would be a chord. So I'm not really going to think of this as a chord so much. I'm going to think of this more just as a melodic phrase. We do see we're going to G now, and we do see the anacrusic start now starting again, but now in the cello. So for now it's just doing the same exact thing. You'll see it switches up a little bit further on, but in the beginning here it's just restating everything 3 times. First you had violin do its thing, it ended, and then as it ended we had the beginning of violin 2. As it's ending, now we have the cello coming in with its anacrusic start, or more like the notes that were the anacrusic start, and now they're just leading up to the beginning of the cello phrase. So we're seeing how the previous material is already helping to build the material that's coming next, just with simple things, just like using this anacrusic start, which was the beginning of the phrase, these 2/16 notes, with these last 2/16 notes of the phrase, so they sort of line up like that. And again, I'm going to analyze these last 2 notes and their relationships. So we have the G going down to an F sharp, and this is the same as the original. It's the same key and everything actually, but now it's just in the bass clef for the cello. So we have the tonic G going down to the 7th, same thing again, but what's happening is the G has a B above it. The G and the B create a third again, just like last time, and then just like last time, both the top and the bottom are moving by a step in the same direction. So we know they're going to create the same interval. They were already a third, so we know it's creating a third, and we see the notes F sharp and A. So again, that's creating a third, but the thing to pay attention to here is that we're creating the 2/3 by putting these notes below what looks like 2 passing tones. In the context of the G leading up to the C, and then those 2 different notes, you can always have 2 passing tones, and that'll fill in the span of a fourth. And if we landed here again on the note of a G, then we'd see that we'd be filling in that span of a fourth. Okay, so the whole point is these seem like non-harmony tones in the context that we have at the moment. And then if we look below that, we see a harmony tone on the first note and a non-harmony note on the second note from the context we know of the melody. And we also see that starting on a G, which this beat, these 4/16 notes did start on a G as well. So they're the same note there. Okay, that leads us to the next line. And as we can see, we just have the melody. So we're just analyzing the melody placed in different voices and how it's modulating for now. This is going to help us a lot when we see the notes filled in because we're going to understand already what's happening. Since I basically went over what's happening, it's modulating. I'll go over this a lot quicker now and I'll kind of wrap this up. Okay, so now we're in G again. We started with G in violin 1, then the phrase happened in violin 2, which went in D major, and now we have the cello doing G major again. So we have that 1-5-1 relationship. We already had that anacrusic start starting us in G major. Now we already know the notes and everything that are going to happen here. It's the same thing that happened before. It's identical. So we have chord 1, first 2 beats. We have chord 5 on the last beat. Then we have the chord 1 again, which ends on the note A. We see the A leads us to B, C, D, then B. This is the same thing that happened before, except we had a C sharp before. The C sharp was telling us that now we're going to D major, but this time we have a C natural. Furthermore, after this leads us down to a G, which leaps up to an F natural. If you're used to very strict counterpoint, you might see a leap of a seventh and think, what's going on here? But this is thinking more in terms of tonal counterpoint with the chords. Okay, so from that G to the F natural, which now tells us we're in C major, goes down to an E, and then a D. Okay, so now we have the end of this phrase, which was in G major, and now we have the bridge, which led us into C major. And now we kept going below. We kept putting the anacrusic start below. And of course, we can't go below anymore, and it's pretty simple. Now we put it in violin 1. So it's kind of like, okay, now we're just in the top again. But doing that could be a little boring if we kept just repeating the same exact melody now, because now we're saying, okay, so we went from violin 1 and then it started violin 2. Violin 2 1, now we went cello. Cello goes, now we're doing violin 1. You can sort of predict what's going to happen now. Now we can predict, okay, exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be the same exact thing happening again and again. Okay? So that's why from here it'd be a really good idea to vary things within the foundation already. So instead of just now having violin 1 do the same exact thing again, and then having violin 2 doing the same exact thing again. And let's say even if they go into different keys. Now we have C major, violin 1. Let's say now violin 2 goes into F major or B flat major. Well, it's still going to be rather boring if we can follow it to that extent. Okay, so we'll see that Gareth actually kept this in mind and he created a variation of what happened in the melody. We'll see that on the next page. And now with the variation creating different moments, he uses those different moments now throughout the piece furthermore to reinforce them and make them a part of the piece. So pay attention to that. We're going to move on to that in a second, but first I'll just look at these two notes as I've been doing. So the last two notes of the phrase in the cello, we're looking at an E going down to a D. Above that in violin 1, we have what was the anacrusic start, which is basically just leading us in to the beginning of violin 1 doing its phrase. Okay, and again, we're in C major. You can guess what notes it's going to have. We see the note C and B. The thing to pay attention to is below that, we have an E. And this isn't CE, this is EC. So this creates a sixth. An easy way to think about a sixth is that it's a inversion of a third. So if you have the notes C and E, you know that creates a third. If you have E and C, you know it creates a sixth. I think it's good to use inversions when you're thinking about sevenths and sixths. So instead of thinking about the sixth, I think about the third inversion. And then instead of thinking about seventh, I just think about a second inversion. And that can help you with the quality. Okay, so we're going to move on a second, but just a quick interval lesson. Sort of know the quality in any key in any circumstance you're working with. Okay, so we know we're in C major in this moment. And we know we have an E with a C above that. Instead of thinking about a sixth, I'll think about C and E. C and E is a third, and if I think about what quality is that, it's a major third. I can simply think that C has a D in the middle, so it's C, D to E. Of course, B and E only have the sharps, so as long as B and E isn't in the first note or the middle note, I know right off the bat it's going to be major if it doesn't have one of those notes if we're just dealing with those natural notes. So it's a simple way of thinking about that. From there, I have C, E. A major third. I know that when I invert something, I'm also inverting the quality. A major becomes minor, minor becomes major, perfect, remains perfect. It's still perfect, but the interval changes. A perfect fifth becomes a perfect fourth. Okay, but then with augmented and diminished, it flips. So you have augmented turns to diminished, diminished turns to augmented. You can think of a tritone. You have an augmented fourth, you have a diminished fifth. Simple lesson there, but you can use this to your advantage of intervals. So now because we have the notes E and C, which C and E creates a major third, if we invert that because we have an EC, now we not only know that we have a sixth, but now we know we have a minor sixth. So E and C is a minor sixth, and you could think about it really quickly like that. The explanation is a lot longer than what it actually takes to do it. It's very simple. Okay, so now we have violin 1. Remember, it's the beginning of the phrase. We just had what was the anacrusic start before this. It's sort of just leading us into the beginning of the phrase. So here we are. We see the chord 1 being highlighted in C major now. Of course, a similar thing. We have C, G, and E. So we have the 1, 5, 3, just like before. Nothing different. The only difference is that after this, we have something similar to what we had in the beginning, to where we had something that goes up and then back down, and everything is sort of identical here up to the first note on the last beat of this first measure here, or this note G. Okay, so we have this passing tone leading us up to this note, which is a G in this case, but now this leaps up a third and goes down 2 steps. This is important because when it leaps up a third, it goes to a B flat. This is a very small detail, but it makes the difference. We were in C natural before, and now we have a B flat. So that's telling us that now we could be looking at F major, or at least we were for a brief moment. Okay, so we see that everything got shortened a lot. It's basically the beginning of the theme. We have chord 1 with the first 2 beats being highlighted, and we go straight into the bridge, which leads us into the next theme, which then, what do we have below that? We have what was the anacrusic start, which leads us into the next theme. We had the B flat, so we're looking at F major now, and we see the notes F natural and E. Above the F is an A, and above the E is a G, and again, those are traveling in those consecutive thirds. I call it consecutive third because you don't know if it's a major or minor third, or I'm not going to pay attention to that. Rather, I'm going to disregard that and just call it consecutive thirds, because if it is major and minor flipping in between them, well, it's still thirds. So they're not going to be parallel thirds unless there was a bunch of major thirds. I'm not going to take the time to really see that. So I'm going to call things that aren't perfect intervals consecutives when each interval's traveling in the same interval in the same direction. Okay? We see that this time the bridge is pretty clear because we have a G leaping up to the B flat. Then we just have the A in the middle back to the G. So it looks like the A is just acting as a passing tone, and then the G and the B flat are the chord tones. So with that, we could be thinking about a G chord, G, B flat, and D. And let's look at what's going on below that, just so we can look at and pick up on some tricks here, and also familiarize ourselves with things that people do that still end up sounding good, even though it might be outside of the context of what you normally might think you should do. Okay, so again, this is borrowed from the anacrusic start, which leads us into the beginning of the next melody. So this is acting as the tonic of this new key. We see an F natural, exactly. It's the tonic note. It still is the tonic note going to the 7th degree back up to the tonic note in F with the F natural there. The point is how it's harmonized changes how it's acting. So it's not just plainly acting as the tonic of F anymore, but instead it's adding harmonic support to this passing tone that is existing in what looks like a G chord. So G, B flat, and D would be the notes we're working with. And then furthermore, the next note goes to an E, while this goes back to a G. And we do know that G was a harmonic tone, and we're also creating a third below it. So now the ending of this is sort of resolving with an E chord, because this whole time we had G and B flat being highlighted sort of as those chord tones, and it ends with an E and a G, which gives us a brief E chord, that E, G, and the B flat. Being borrowed from before, it's doing the same thing where it's going from the tonic to the 7th degree back up to the tonic. And now we have something similar here to where we have the beginning of the next theme. So we're doing the same thing. We went from violin 1, we went to violin 2. We again had the intro, which led us into the next theme in the new key, and then also those beginning 2 notes of the new theme harmonized with the last 2 notes of the last theme, even though everything was shortened to just a measure now. So everything was shortened, but it still has the same structure from before, even though it's just the simple melody switching between voices at this point. We see a structure already that we're going to be basing everything off of. Okay, so now we're in F major. We see the F goes down to a C, that goes down to an A. Exactly the same thing. We have the F chord and we have the 1, 5, and the 3. Okay, so now we see a variation here. Originally, this went up a step, and now it's going up a fifth. Because again, this is the same borrowed idea from the very beginning, and this is the first time that we actually see these first two beats of the beginning of the theme have an alteration to it. Okay, so again, now we have that fifth, and it's going from that A to an E flat. Well, now we have B flat and E flat. Okay, so now this is looking like we're already looking at a bridge heading us towards B flat, the key of B flat. From here, we have a D, E flat, back to a D and C. The E flat's not labeled because it's all in the same measure, so it's just standard scoring here, standard thinking. That C then leads us back down to a B. Okay, so now we see a B natural. So we see we had a brief modulation there. It looked like we're going to B flat, and then all of a sudden we had a B natural. As the B is ringing out, halfway through it begins the start of the melody, now starting again in violin 1. So you might have expected this now going to the cello, because we had the violin 1, violin 2, and cello. We kept doing that. We're thinking, okay, we're probably going to do that again, but we actually started getting some variation in the melody and the rhythm, and also within the keys that we're using, we have some modulations happening in some different areas, a brief modulation, but not only that, but now the structure of where the voices are changing alters as well. So now we're back up into violin 1, and now let's look at the notes that we have. So we have a G, F, G. Okay, so it looks like now we're back in G major again. Well, that's kind of interesting. If we think, we started in G, we went to D, went back to G, went to C, and then we went to F, which went back to C, which is the beginning of this. That led us to F, which happened pretty quickly. Things started shortening and speeding up. And then halfway through what we thought would probably be F, even if it was shortened, then we have a brief modulation, which makes us think, okay, now we're going further into B flat, and all of a sudden then we land on the note B natural. So we think, okay, no more B flat, it was just a brief modulation, maybe we're back in F major. But in fact, no, we're not going in F major, and we're not going one key over to C major, we're going another key over to G major. So nothing too crazy or anything happening, but we see how the expectations were being led to and then thrown off. Even with the shortened melody, we still had an idea that, okay, we have an idea kind of what's still going on. This is shortened, this is still acting like a modulation of a bridge. Whether we consciously realize this or our ears just kind of pick up on what's going on, we're following along and we're kind of having a familiarity and we're able to keep track of what's going on here. All of a sudden it goes into a different voice than we expect, and then in a different key than we expect, and at a different time than we expect. We kept having the anacoustic start at the end of the bar, which normally was occurring through that bigger phrase, but now we shortened everything the last two measures, and already right away we could adapt pretty quickly and say, okay, well, we see what's going on here. Everything's shortened, but it's the same thing at the end. At the very end of this bar, we have the pickup of the next bar, and then at the very end of this bar, we're going to have the pickup of the next bar, and we don't. We actually lead on to the next bar where we have a resolution of what just happened, where this tone rings out while above it forms that beginning of that theme, which before was occurring at the end of the measure, but now does not only occur at the beginning of the measure, but has that eighth note rest. So those little things make all the difference. We have this little short breath here, and then now we're starting in the beginning, and now we're in G major, so everything's kind of thrown around here, but it's based off what was happening before and based off material that we already had before, and things are kind of just altering. So the listener will still be able to keep track of it and still be able to comprehend what's going on and fit it into what happened before and create this relationship musically. But in fact, what's happening is they're going to pay a lot more attention, because what's happening here is not only throwing off what they're expecting with the note durations, but also the notes themselves. And then it goes to the actual duration of the melody itself, which gets thrown off. And then key changes. Just all these little things, they help to keep the listener on their toes or really listening carefully and saying, huh, it's kind of interesting, didn't really expect that. But with everything being based off what was before and what was after, it creates this coherence to where you're not just hearing, which sounds like someone on a guitar maybe noodling around, is what people call it. We hear all these notes going doodle all over the place. You can't really tell what's going on or where it's going. And although some people are really good at this and might actually be able to make this sound really good, noodling is often the characteristic of an amateur guitar player who doesn't really know what they're doing, and they're sort of just playing a bunch of endless scales and different notes in patterns that they know, and it doesn't really sound like it's going anywhere or it is anywhere. It just kind of sounds like a bunch of random notes. So the fact is that what we're doing here is we're allowing that not to happen by reusing a lot of the harmonic ideas, the rhythmic ideas, the melodic ideas from before, but altering everything to where it's still interesting. Because like I was saying, if we just kept repeating everything before, where we had theme 1 in violin 1, and then it goes to violin 2, and then it goes to the cello, and we just kept doing that over and over. Even if we went to a bunch of different keys and did some modulations we didn't expect, well, it would get kind of boring. So we see this is playing on multiple different things in a clever way that is allowing a lot more interest and just giving this a lot better of an end product. So now we have this B, and it's going against this G here, because of course, as this B is ringing out, the G starts halfway through it. And if you think of a G chord, well, you think the notes G, B, and D. So it's simply creating a sixth, as well as occurring within the chord of what would be a G chord. So we could definitely use that to our advantage if we were to fill in notes by analyzing that. And then of course the F is just going to act like a neighboring tone in between the G notes. So whatever note we might choose to harmonize with that G chord, the F is still going to act just like that neighboring tone. So now we're in G major, we have the beginning of the phrase, we have a G, D, B. So just like before, we have the 1, 5, 3 of the chord, and just like the measure before this, we kept doing the same thing to where instead of going up a step, like we always did in the past for the beginning of this theme the whole way through, until the measure before this, where we leapt up that fifth to that note that was the altered note in the new key, well, we see that we kept up with that same familiar idea here. So Gareth mentioned in the video is that when you have an idea that goes outside of what you were normally doing, it's a good idea to then repeat it at least 3 times in a movement. So here we see that new idea being presented. We have the 1, 5, 3 of the tonic chord of the new key. It always leapt up a step, now it's leaping up a fifth to that note that's establishing that new key, or in this case kind of did a brief modulation. So we see the same idea repeated here, to where we have the tonic chord of G, we have the G, D, B, so it's just spelling out the G chord, and then that goes up to an F natural. Now if we're thinking about G major, of course, we're thinking about F sharp. Now if we have an F natural, now we're establishing a new key, or maybe just doing a brief modulation again, just like before. And we're just going to think that we were in G, and we're just going to think about the modulations from this key before, just so we think about where we are. We started from C, we went to F, we had a brief little look at B flat, and then we went back to G major. G major then landed us back in C major. So now we're back in C from G. Okay, now we see something interesting here. We see there's a note in violin 1, probably for harmonic support, and that is an E, but the thing to pay attention to is here all of a sudden we have something similar happening to where we already have the beginning of the phrase again. We have the same thing happening to where we have the 8th note rest, and then we have the beginning of the phrase. So we see these little things that he altered that then he's keeping as sort of the structure of what's going on here. So with this, we still have the original one that we could do, and now we have this new one. And since we had those two that altered, we could further alter this, and we could probably add more alterations to this. Maybe go up a 4th next time, maybe go up a 3rd next time. Okay, so those are just ideas, but the fact is that you can see something a little differently happening, and that is that since we already ended up in this theme here, we didn't have the melodic phrase from up above that modulated us to here. And in fact, this is the first measure that doesn't have the bridge leading up before it. So throughout this entirety of this small little piece here, we always had what was borrowed from the anacoustic start, leading us into the intro, which is 2 beats. And then that originally occurred as a longer phrase that then led us up to the bridge. But then in the previous measures, we saw things got shortened to where we still had the beginning of the anacoustic start. We had the beginning 2 beats of that beginning theme, and then we just ended with that 1 beat where we had the bridge, which led us into the new key. Okay, so let's back up a second here. So we can see that even when things were shortened, we had the anacoustic start before this in violin 1, we had the beginning 2 beats of theme 1, and then we had the last beat, which was a bridge, which led us from C to F in this case. We have something similar. We have the beginning of the anacrusic start. We have those 2 beats, which is the beginning of the next theme in the new key. And then again, we have that bridge, which leads us into that new key. But in fact, something altered here to where this was no longer acting so much as a bridge, because this note here was telling us that we were in a new key when we leapt up the 5th. So again, remember, we had that alteration of the original beginning of theme 1 to where now we're leaping up a 5th and we're leaping up to a note that alters the key that we were in. So we're already thinking we're in B flat now. But in fact, when we go to the next measure, we end up in a different key. We end up in G major like we said. But the thing to pay attention to is that now we not only started the anacrusic start in the beginning of this measure, just with that little 8th note rest, where before every single time it occurred at the end of the measure, but now we have those 2 beats, which are the beginning of theme 1, and they end in the same way, where they have the 1, 5, and 3 of the chord, which then leaps up a 5th from that 3rd of the chord to a new altered note, which tells us that we're going to a different key. So that happens again, but this is sort of acting as that modulatory bridge. So instead of having this modulatory bridge that was actually the 4/16 notes, which before was actually 8/16 notes, it got shortened here to the very end in these measures, to where in these measures you just had this bridge being these 4 notes. Now ending here in this last measure, you don't have 4 notes acting as a bridge at all. In fact, you just have what was borrowed from the measure before it acting as a note bridge. So it's not a melodic bridge, it's just a bridge of an interval. So it's just a bridge of a new note taking you to that new key. And then we see how that gets further implicated as we look further on. Okay, so now we're back on the next line and we see it's the same thing to where we have that 8th note rest. We have what was borrowed from the anacrusic start, and then we have those 2 beats, which is the beginning of theme 1 right there. But then it's the same idea. We don't have a modulatory bridge of melodic notes. We just have the chord spelled out, the 1, 5, 3, which then from that 3rd leaps up a 5th to that new note, to that new altered note, which tells us the new key. So now this variation, this idea, is getting further reinstated, taking us to different keys. So now we have the same thing, which is a variation of what happened from the very beginning. But now from this variation of the variation, we're keeping this idea and we're repeating it just in different keys now. So it's creating this familiarity, and it already is familiar from something that was familiar before that. And it's not becoming redundant because it is creating variation and is jumping to all these different keys. And now we're seeing modulations happening quicker. So the harmonic rhythm is not increasing in the chords so much at the moment with the basic idea that we have, but the harmonic rhythm is increasing in the modulations. And not just increasing, but altering. Okay, so we're not always expecting what's happening. We're hearing all these different keys. And when scored properly, it gives a nice effect to a trained listener's ear or an untrained listener's ear. Okay, so back with that whole thing. We had that idea, the variation of the variation. Now we kept that idea. Now we have the same thing to where this B flat leads us down to an A. So as this A is ringing out, we see an F natural above it. And these 2/16 notes occur halfway through this quarter note. And again, we see that 6th relationship with the A and the F natural. To where again, we think F and A, we think, okay, that's a major 3rd. So we know we have A, F. We know that we have a minor 6th here. And it's the same thing. We have what was borrowed from the anacrusic start, starts on the 1st degree of the new chord, goes down a step, which is like the leading tone, goes back up a step to the tonic. Then from that tonic note, goes down the 4th and another 3rd, or in other words, from the chord tones, it goes from the 1 to the 5 to the 3. Think about F, A, C, and F chord. See F, C, then A leaps back up to an E flat. So we have that same exact thing. We have the 1, 5, 3 of the chord, then from that 3 of the chord, leaping up a 5th to that altered note. It's the same idea, it's what's happening. And now we have E flat, and we already had B flat before that. We didn't have anything else telling us that we did not have a B flat. We just had an additional E flat. So now we're thinking that we're in B flat major. So when you see the B flat colon, how I'm labeling this, that's the key. B flat is the key because we have the note E flat. And you see below that I'm just labeling the notes with B flat, F natural. So let's look at that. So now we go on, this E flat goes down to the D. As the D is held out, below it, now we have a B flat. And this plays off perfectly what we had before. Before we kept having below a note lingering, then as the beginning of what was borrowed from the anacrusic start comes in, that first note creates the sixth. We have the A and the F. In this case, now for the first time, the beginning of this phrase, which is borrowed from the anacrusic start, has the lingering quarter note above it. And instead of being a sixth above it or something like that, it's just a third above it, which is the inversion of being a sixth below. So if the same note was below, it would be a sixth below. So it's basically taking the same note that would be below and now putting it above. So everything is playing off itself, even when it's switching to these different voices. So we see that B flat and the D relationship of that third, and then we see the lower neighboring tone going back up to the B flat. B flat then goes to F natural and D. Of course, we have an F natural because we're in the key of B flat now. So we just have a B flat and E flat. And F natural, of course, already occurs in B flat major. So I think I just labeled that because it was an accidental. And I was just labeling the accidentals that were there. But then we see that from the D, we do the same thing where we leap up to an A flat. So again, we're in the new key. We're in B flat major. The B flat goes down to an A, which goes back up to the B flat. So we're on the tonic note that goes down the fourth and the third, which spells out that chord. So we're thinking about B flat, D, F, and we see B flat, F, D. Again, from that third of the chord, it leaps up a fifth to that altered note. So the same exact thing is repeated. And actually for now, we just have the same exact rate of modulation. So we're building this familiarity. Now we have this very short section, which if we really think of where this came from, we have the very beginning from the anacrusic start. We have an idea which basically came directly from the very first two beats of the theme originally, and instead it just goes up that fifth now to that new note. But we can think of this fifth leap up to this new note and this modulation being inspired from the modulatory bridge from the very beginning. So basically the whole idea from the very beginning is compressed to an extreme amount. So now we still have the beginning phrase, and we still basically have the beginning of the theme, and it ends with a modulation similarly to what was happening at the ending of the entirety of the theme from the very beginning, the original theme. Okay, so we see not only the structure is repeated, but it's maintained from the very beginning. It's just now shortened. Things are in different areas. The anacrusic start isn't starting at the very end of the measure. So a lot of things are getting altered, but in ways that are perfectly coherent. Okay, so the last note before this, we had that A flat, which then before that we had a B flat and an E flat. So now it looks like we're in E flat major. And we see the same thing keeps repeating to where we have the lingering note, which is above, where we have the G with an E flat below it. So it's creating that third relationship still, same idea. And then same thing to where you have the beginning of the anacrusic start, the 1 going down to the lead tone, going back up to the 1. You have the chord where you have going down a fourth, going down a third. From there, it goes back up a fifth to the new altered note telling you the new key. So now we were in E flat, and now we're making our way further down the left side or the counterclockwise side of the circle of fifths. So now we see G goes to D flat. Now it tells us we are in A flat major because we had B flat, E flat, A flat, and now D flat. We furthermore established that by repeating the notes E flat and B flat, which just reminded us that, okay, we're not going out of a different key. We're not doing a brief modulation to any other keys. We just went from E flat to A flat. And now we have the last two measures. To where here we see an idea that was borrowed from the last beat of the first measure of the original theme. To where you just start on a note, you go up 2 steps, and you go down another step. And then we see 2 eighth notes here, which we also see 2 eighth notes occurring in the bottom voices, which don't only occur in these last 2 measures here, but also show up in the response that we're going to see a second with all the notes filled in. So none of this stuff is ever really random at all. It all not only has its place harmonically and rhythmically, but also structurally. Then after that, we just see a melody that goes from a note down a third and then up 2 steps. And this is actually borrowed from the beginning of this second page here, to where you actually had an alteration of this original melody that occurred, to where you just go up 2 steps and down a step, and that was varied into going up a third and then down 2 steps, to where now it is flipped, and now you're just going down a third and up 2 steps. So all this stuff is familiar. Then that just ends on a half note. We have that quarter note rest after. I think it's a really nice touch. And at the end of this, we're going to look at some further ways that we can keep exactly what he wrote, but add some things like dynamics, articulations, and possibly even things like tempo changes. Okay, but let's get into the harmonic stuff here, because we actually see this last section is actually filled out. So this is actually creating a cadence. So what he explained in the video is that he was going all throughout the circle of fifths, going to all these different keys. So we know he started in G, we went to D, went back to G, then went to C, went to F, went through B flat, E flat, and now we're in A flat. But the whole thing is we need to end up in G major from where we started. That's the goal. We want to end up where we started. We want to form that perfect cadence to G major, telling us, okay, this is the end. We started in G major, we did all these modulations, and now we're ending back in G major with a perfect cadence. But then how are we going to get from A flat major to G major? If you think about the circle of fifths, that's sort of random. And here's a really good trick that he shared. So if you think of a Neapolitan chord that's built off the flattened second degree, we want to end in G major, and we think of the flattened second degree of G major, we have A flat. Well, that's where we were. We were in A flat, we want to get to G major. Now what happens if we build a Neapolitan chord, which would be taking the flattened second degree of the scale that we're using and building a major chord on top of that. So we have G, we have A, we flatten it, we have A flat, we build a major chord. We get the notes A flat, C, and E flat. From here, the chord is supported with a C and an E flat, both existing in the chord, and then the melody starting on an A flat, going to a B flat, acting as a passing tone, which is in the key, up to C, back down to that B flat. The B flat is just acting again as a passing tone, which leads us to these eighth notes, to where you have the A flat and the G. Okay, so we see that Neapolitan chord spelled out throughout the melody, and especially with the harmonic support below it, adding to the fact that we have all the notes in that Neapolitan chord. So we could think of those first two beats as the Neapolitan chord. Then we could think of this last beat as the fifth chord of G major, which is going to lead to a perfect cadence. Okay, so we see the notes F sharp, D natural, E natural, and F sharp. Yes, it's plain to read that, but I labeled it because those are the notes that were not existing in the key previously. So we're thinking about A flat major, all of a sudden we have an F sharp, D natural, E natural, and F sharp. It's also interesting just to look at the fact that we had these notes in the key labeled as accidentals, and we just chose notes that are completely different than those notes. And since they weren't labeled with any accidentals at all, and they were already in the key of G major from the key signature, it just put us right into that new key. So I think it's just cool how that turned out, because a lot of times you will have a note that will actually establish that, okay, we're not using that B flat anymore, we're not using that A flat anymore. But in this case, we just use completely different notes than what was before. So I just find that interesting. Then if we think about a G and we think about the fifth chord, we'd be thinking about a D chord, which would have the notes D, F sharp, and A. So we see that F sharp and that D, the D and the F sharp. We see the E and another F sharp. So the E looks like it's just acting as a passing tone, a non-harmonic tone. Then we'll look below that. We'll look at the first section before. So in the cello, we have a D. Above that, in violin 2, we have a D. Okay, so nothing really big going on there. The same notes. Above both of those, we have an F, which then goes to a D. Okay, so nothing crazy there. We have a third above those two notes, and then an octave of those two notes, and it's all existing in that chord. So those are all chord tones there, and it's all existing on the strong beats. Okay, so it's the very beginning of that new chord. Then we also have the 16th note in the middle of that, but we also have a chord tone. And then the next note, we have a D. Above that, we have a C. And then above that, we have the E passing tone to the F sharp. Okay, so a little interesting here. Where these two eighth notes start, the beginning of that would be this third 16th note here, which is going to be a non-harmony note of E. So if we think about the D and a C and then an E, so we see a D with a C above it, so that's a seventh interval right there. And then we see the C has an E above that, so that creates a third with those two. But then from the cello to violin 1, we see the D and the E creates a second. So we see some dissonance there. But it doesn't just create dissonance because it's a 16th note, and while these are occurring, it then goes to an F. So now you have a D and an F. So just a third. So in the non-harmonic tone of this passing tone, it created a second briefly with the bass note, but then resolved onto a third at the end. So very interesting how that worked out. And then these two voices are still going to create the seventh with the D and the C. But now the C and the F are going to create a fourth. So it's definitely not something that I would have thought to choose, but I think it turned out really well, and I'm taking notes from it. So from here we see stepwise motion to the note that creates the cadence in the two violins. We have an F going to a G, to the seventh going to a 1, a lot of times known as the soprano cadence. Then we have a C going to a B, so the fourth degree going to the third degree, oftentimes called a Burgundian cadence. And then we have a D going up a fourth to a G, which is oftentimes called the bass cadence. You have your 5 to your 1. And if we look at the notes that were chosen for the cadence of the three voices, we just see a G, a B, and a G. So just a 1, a 3, and a 1, thinking of a G chord. And this has to do partly with the fact that the melody ended in the top, which resolved to a G, and then you wanted to also support that with the bass being a G below that. And of course, you don't just want 3 octaves in a row, especially ending a cadence. So instead of choosing another G, B was chosen. So you see with 3 voices here, it's a little simpler, and you're not always shooting for complete chords. Sometimes you're actually sacrificing complete chords for nice melodic fluency, for nice stepwise motion, or just for the end result that you're looking for. It is good to try to shoot for as many complete chords as you can. So as we're looking and examining these other notes, we'll pay attention to how those notes are going to be completing the chords which might be incomplete from the material that we have as a foundation. Okay, so now that we're familiar with this, let's listen to this section, this second part, with just having the melody and the different voices. Try to pay attention to the modulations and the things that I went over. And then after this, we're going to analyze the notes filled in. We're going to see what notes were chosen and think about why they were chosen and gain some insights, as well as sharing many tips and things that Gareth went through in his video as well. Okay, so now here we are at the third part. Here's where the notes are filled in. You might notice, and you might have noticed when you listen to the playback, that there's no notes filled in the beginning here. And no, this is not a mistake. This is simply just the entry in the one instrument, so you can follow along the one line, and then you can, after this, hear violin 2 come in, where then you'll have violin 1 and 2 both playing now, and then as you guessed, after violin 2 played, then the cello comes in, and now you have all 3 of the instruments playing at the same time for the most part. There's some parts where there's maybe a gap, and then the other 2 instruments will kind of fill those in with what they're doing, and at the same time there'll be certain parts where 1 or maybe 2 instruments will be going a little slower, and then the other instrument or instruments will be going faster, and you'll hear the difference, but everything will work out to where you'll have each instrument playing its own melody. So if you pay attention to it, you'll still be able to follow each instrument, and the melody will be jumping between each instrument. So if you're following the melody, then you're going to hear as it's going between the instrument, then you're going to hear how the instruments are surrounding that changing melody and how that might change the nature of it. Okay, so we already went over this first part here. Everything's the same. So now we can just move on to the next line. Here we are in the next line. As we saw, it was in G major. We had the bridge there leading to D major. And then we had that anacrusic start, which was used as the very last 2 16th notes leading up to the phrase now being in violin 2. But now we can see the notes filled in violin 1. Now these two instruments are going to be playing, and then you see the cello in the last two 16th notes coming in with what was the anacoustic start and is acting just like the intro to the theme. So in part 2, I already went over what happened in violin 1, so I don't need to re-go over the theme, but what I am going to go over is what happens in violin 1, what Gareth mentioned in the video. I'm going to try to do my best to also cover in this video, but I'm also going to be paying attention to what's happening with the note against notes, and then the chords that he's using, and the things like the passing tones, and break it down. Okay, before we get into the actual notes and the harmony and stuff like that, let's look at a simpler level first, and let's look at the rhythm of the notes chosen. And since this was actually a walkthrough of Gareth scoring this, luckily I was actually able to hear the reasons why he scored what he did, and I don't just have to guess and say, oh, I think this is probably why, but I actually get to say, okay, this is why he did this, because he mentioned it and I wrote down the notes. So with that anacoustic start in the beginning with these two 16th notes that keep occurring at the end of the measure as the intro to the theme, what occurs there is the two 16th notes, as you can imagine, happen right before this violin 2, okay, and then it leads you into the intro. So as you know, it's the two 16th notes leading into these four 8th notes. That's what I'm trying to explain here. Okay, so what happens when we have those two 16th notes leading to these 8th notes is we already have that relationship. We're used to having this relationship of the two 16th notes to the two 8th notes, and then as you can also see at the ending of these two 8th notes, we have the two 8th notes going to this row of the 16th notes. So we're used to hearing these things, and he took advantage of this, and up here you can see simply he just did an 8th note to two 16th notes, an 8th note to two 16th notes. So of course that's not exactly what we have here at all, but it's based on material that we've heard, to where, as you can see, this is just doing a neighboring motion, and it's starting from one note, going down, and going back up with that neighbor note in the middle, and the next one just goes two steps down. So you have a note, and then you have a neighboring tone, and then it ends on another note, and instead of just now doing that exact thing 3 different times, now he made it a little more interesting by just adding two 8th notes, and it's not just two 8th notes, but now it's two 8th notes going against these four 16th notes. So you have that difference in the rhythm, helping each of these stand out more on their own. And at the same time, if you look before that, you see that you had a mixture of 8th notes and 16th notes, as violin 2 was just playing 8th notes. So again, you have a difference in rhythm, and in this case, violin 1 is not just playing a row of 16th notes, but it's playing a different rhythm, especially differing from what we're used to hearing with the theme that we were already presented in the beginning, so that helps it stick out even more. And then furthermore, these two 8th notes come from previous material as well, as we already have been having a bunch of 8th notes, so it's just playing off rhythmic values that we've heard before, and we can see similar things where we just see these two notes that are a step away, these are a step away. Of course, that's something you're commonly going to do, but this is not something that we previously have not heard yet. We've previously already heard a good amount of 8th notes one step away. So it all is familiar content to this point, and there's nothing happening that basically has not already happened before. That's something very good to point out here. We're going to talk about the notes and the harmony in a second, but just to look at the next section, it's basically very similar. He used the same 8th note to two 16th notes with a neighboring motion now, and this is a slight variation to where now you actually have this going up a third, going down a step. When it goes down a step, that's acting as a passing tone, leading you into these two 8th notes, and those are just a step away going down just like we had before. And then like we see here, it's a variation, and it plays off what we had before. So before we had it going up a third and down a step, and now we have it going up a fourth and then down a step. This is something that I see Bach doing a lot, just little things like this, and they sound really nice, and you kind of wonder what's going on because you have this familiar thing that's going on, and it keeps changing slightly. Okay, and then if we look underneath that, we just see a row of 16th notes for those 3 beats. So those 3 beats have their distinct 16th notes. Very easy to follow that, of course, because it's moving very quickly with short note durations. Not only that, but at the same time, you see it is very conjunct. See a lot of stepwise motion. In fact, I see one leap of a third here, and I see one leap of a fourth here. Other than that, it's completely stepwise by seconds. And of course, underneath those last two 16th notes, we have the 2/16 notes, which is starting that next theme now in the cellos in the different key. And we can see obviously what key it is because the beginning note is always the key. So we see it starting on a G, so we know that this is starting in the key of G. We also see the note, the bridge from D to G. So we already talked about all of the modulations. So now we're going to talk about the notes that were chosen, and it will reveal the harmony and some interesting ideas. So let's refresh that we're just highlighting chord 1 here. So we're thinking the notes D, F, A. So we have a D chord, and we see the notes D, A, and F. So the 1, 5th, and 3rd. Then for now it's going up that step, so this passing tone is just a non-harmony tone in the chord. It's the 4th of the chord, and we're interested in the D, F, and A. Okay, so with that in mind that we're thinking the harmony tones are D, F, and A, let's see the notes chosen above. And then also pay attention to the note durations and see where the things are lining up, okay? Okay, so of course looking at harmony, I'm thinking what's below to above. So I'm thinking, okay, I have a D with a G above that. Okay, so now that we know that we're highlighting a D chord below with that non-harmony passing tone at the very last of the 8th notes, then let's look above that and let's notice that I changed this one note. I thought that he wrote G, F, G, and I was thinking, well, why the heck would he put G and then use F as a sort of what looks like a neighboring tone and then go back to G? And I just thought it just didn't really make sense. So then I looked back at what he wrote, because in that case I probably made a mistake, and I did. So it turns out he actually wrote F twice and then G. So you'll see sometimes he does a repeated tone here, which I find very interesting because it's not conventional that a lot of people say, oh, do a repeated tone. But you will see people like Bach do repeated tones here and there, and I think it's something to consider. He actually has videos also how to do things like harmonize just one repeated note. He does a really good job, and I just recommend his videos. Okay, other than that, we see this makes a lot more sense now, because we have the F sharp, and we know we want D, F sharp, A. If you hear me not mentioning the accidentals, I'm just trying to mention the chords that we're building, the notes that are in the chords. I definitely know the accidentals because I'm looking at them. Okay, so we see the F sharp and then another F sharp, so those are both harmonic tones at the moment. And then also at the same time, we see this 8th note is going to the 16th notes. So we look below it and we see that as the 8th notes start on a D and then go to A, making their way to F, we see the voice above starts on the F sharp, and then it does the F sharp again with the 16th note now, which of course is the first half of this 8th note, which is an A now. You have the G passing tone at the second half of this A. So you have those two harmony tones, the A and the F, and they're not only harmony tones, but they're creating a 6th, A on the bottom and F on the top. So it's good when you're harmonizing two notes moving together with thirds and sixths, and to not be too redundant or repetitive with that though. Okay, so from those two 16th notes, we go to A, and that's above right here where we have an F. So we have an F and an A. We just have a third, or in a literal case, we have a 10th right here. The F goes to a G, which the G acts as the passing tone linking to the A of the start of the 16th notes. If we look above the G, we see those two 16th notes, and we see a G going to an F. So we just have an octave, and then we have a passing tone leading us to above those 16th notes to where we have those 8th notes. But before we look at that, let's pay attention to the fact that we had an octave there. So we had a G and a G, and we know that if we have an octave, we don't want parallel motion, and if we have two voices, we don't even want direct motion. We definitely want contrary motion. And we see that occurs here. A goes down to the G, so we see the top voice is moving down, and then we see the bottom voice, the F, is moving up to the G. So as the bottom voice is moving up, the top voice is moving down. But not only is the top voice moving down on the G, but those two 16th notes occur at the same moment as the 8th note, and it continues to go down to where we have the F sharp. Okay, and then it keeps going down to those two 8th notes, which I looked, and we actually have a C sharp here. So sorry that I wrote down some wrong notes, but if you saw the original that I was copying, it's not very neat at all, and it was kind of hard to read. Okay, so I'm making sure to double check this as I go, so that's why I caught this. Okay, so we see we're going to chord 5 in D major. So we think about that, we just think that we have an A, and we have the F sharp and the C sharp now in the key signature. We see down below, we start with an A, we go up to a B, we go back down to an A, so it's just an upper neighboring tone. The A are the harmonic tones, the B is a non-harmonic tone, and that goes down to a G, which acts as a passing tone to the next measure. So the G is also a non-harmony tone. The harmony tones are the A and the A. And again, we were looking for A, C sharp, E. So we look above that, and we see an E, and it leaps down to a C sharp. So that just completes the fact that we had an A below it. Now we have the C sharp and the E, a completed A chord. We also see an overall contrary motion to everything, to where we see these eighth notes are traveling down and they travel back up. Above it travels up and then back down, and then below it leaps up and goes back down, and then above that it leaps down. Okay, the next measure we have some 16th notes, and then above that we have the other notes corresponding with that. We also see that although the other notes have their own rhythm, they are very clearly showing you each of the 3 beats. Same with the measure before. So the 8th notes are easy to follow, and those are the 2 beats, and then the 16th notes that are faster act as a whole beat when we're thinking about this 3/4 time that we're in. Okay, so we're clearly distinguishing each of the beats and each of the measures, which is also something really important to note. Okay, so now we're in D, and then remember this is chord 1, we had chord 5, that led us to chord 1 with the first beat here, these 4 16th notes. Then after that, these next 8 16th notes are going to act somehow as the bridge from D to G, and we'll see where that's happening. Okay, so first off, we have chord 1 in D major. We see F, E, and D. That goes back up to E. So the D and the F are those chord tones there in the D chord, the D, F, and the A. E is acting as a passing tone in both cases. Then where the E leaves off brings you to an F with the next beat. F, G, A, and then an F. So it's highlighting F and A, so that's an F chord there. The G is the non-harmony tone. So we have a D chord, an F chord. Where F leaves off goes to a G, which leaps up to a C, and then it descends down 2 steps, so we have a B and an A. Okay, so now let's just analyze what happens above that. And as I mentioned before, we have the G leaping up to the C, so it looks like the relationship here is the C to the G, and then we have 2 passing tones of A, B, and A. This would also be a perfect time for these 2 passing tones because it occurs on the weaker section of the already weak beat. So we know we have a strong, weak, and a weak beat with a 3/4 time. But then with these 16th notes, if we think about this like 2 8th notes, this first section of 2 16th notes would be like the first section of the 8th note, the stronger part of the 8th note, and then these next section of these 2 16th notes would be like the second duration of the 8th note. So just where it falls metrically, this is an even weaker part of this row of 16th notes. And furthermore, of course, if we're looking at the 3rd and the 4th 16th note, this 4th 16th note is even weaker than the 3rd one, so it's sort of the weakest note in this measure. There's good things to pay attention to, like making sure these weak beats are actually emphasized, not to the extent of going to the 16th notes, but here we have a pattern of at least doing 8th notes, so we want to keep this rhythmic pattern of these 8th notes at least hitting on each of the weak beats somewhere within the counterpoint. So at least one of the voices hitting on one of those weak beats for the entirety of this piece, because it's playing off the regular beats as 8th notes. The faster ones are going to be 16th notes. We're going to see some slower notes that are going to be quarter notes. And then of course at the very end we have some half notes, which are the very slow notes, slowing everything down and finishing it. Okay, so we know we start with a D chord, and we see actually above we have a D in violin 1. The D leaps up a 3rd to an F, and then we have a passing tone of an E, while the D leaps up to an F in the top voice. Then the voice below that, which is put into violin 2 here, is traveling from F with 16th notes down to D. And yes, I do know it's F sharp, but it's a little bit of a bother to mention every single accidental, especially when it's already in the key signature. So I'm reading an F, and F sharp is in the key signature, okay? So that's a given. And we see the next row of 16th notes, and as these are making their way from F through G as the passing tone up to A, and then back to F, we have the note D starting off, which ends on the note C with the 8th notes. We also notice that we have a C natural. So we no longer have C sharp like the measure before, and now we're bridging from D back to G. Now down below we have the G going up to the C, so we have the C and the G as those chord tones. We see something interesting here is that as the G leaps up to a C, in the voice above that the B leaps up to an E, and then it steps down to a D. So we think in the context of the B and the D as chord tones, and we look below them, we see the G, we could think G, B, D, and we have a G chord. But then if we think the C is a chord tone and the E is a chord tone and also the A is a chord tone, we see that it looks like there's A, C, and E. So it's sort of interesting what's happening here, because what's happening here is all perfectly within the rules of even strict counterpoint. So we have in the beginning of this beat a note leaping up a fourth, going down steps. At the same time above that, we have a note that's creating a third with it. They both leap up the interval of a fourth at the same time. So because of that, they're a fourth above where they were, both of them are, and because of that, they're still creating the interval of a third, the C and the E. Then you have the B and the D, and then as that's happening, we have this going down to the note of an A. So it sort of works as two different chords there, and everything functions fine within the counterpoint. So we didn't mention why he chose these notes, so I can only speculate what I'm thinking the chords might be. To me, it seems like he didn't stick too strictly to saying, okay, this has to be one chord, but sort of did something that worked harmonically and actually included a chord kind of within another chord is kind of what it seems like. But then if we look below that all, we have in the cello now, we have the two last 16th notes, which are going from G to F. So it's closing on that G sort of as the strong part of these two 16th notes. The F very well could be a chord tone as well, and in some way it could briefly hint at an F7 chord possibly, but I think it's more realistic to say that we have this G here, and then we also have the G occurring in the beginning of the beat with the B above it, and then that's ending on the D. We also have a B here, so I think it's further reinforcing that G chord, the G, B, and the D. But of course with the F you probably do get a bit of an implication of the F7 chord, because you just heard the F and an A, and it leaped up to a C, and it also leaped up to an E. All that's very fresh in our ears at the moment. Okay, so now we're on the next line, and the ending of the measure before this were those two 16th notes that were borrowed from the anacrusic start, acting as the intro into the cello part, playing the theme. So now we see the cello part playing the theme, and we see now there's the violin 2 and violin 1 played above this. So now we have some more notes to analyze. Let's first pay attention to the rhythm, point out some things. First, the varying rhythm, with the cello down below playing these 8th notes and then a row of 16th notes, starting with these 4 8th notes on beats 1 and 2, going to the row of 4 16th notes, which is beat 3 of this measure here. We see above it, violin 2 is playing a row of 16th notes in beat 1. Then it's playing the 8th note to 2 16th notes on beat 2, and then it has 8th notes on beat 3. So each one of these beats is actually playing something different, helping it kind of have its own little theme here. But then on top of that, pay attention to the 16th notes against the 8th notes, and then the 8th note to 16th notes against the 8th notes again, allowing this to stick out on its own, and then of course the 8th notes against the 16th notes. And above that we see something similar, but we see the 8th note to 2 16th notes is chosen above these 2 8th notes here, and at the same time is chosen above these 4 16th notes here. So each 3 of these voices are doing a completely different rhythm. We move on to the next 2 8th notes, and we do have 2 8th notes above in violin 1, but we see they're traveling in contrary motion towards each other. This is happening while violin 2 in the middle is playing a completely different rhythm. We do have it starting with an 8th note, but we have the 2 16th notes helping it stick out. So maybe not completely different. Okay, we're going to go over the actual notes and everything in a second here, but then we'll pay attention to how in the last beat we have the same thing where each 3 of the instruments, each 3 of the voices have their own completely different rhythm. The cello is playing 4/16 notes, violin 2 is playing 2/8 notes, and violin 1 is now playing 2/16 notes and an eighth note. So now we have the same rhythm like before with the eighth note going to 2/16 notes, but now we have 2/16 notes going to an eighth note. So not only is it just a slight variation that plays off just 3 notes, but we already have plenty of times heard 2/16 notes going to an eighth note. So all of it is completely familiar. And now we also have another rhythmic device based off a variation of this rhythmic device, which is the eighth note going to the 2/16 notes. Okay, then with all those differing rhythms, something interesting happens when we look at the next measure. We see all of a sudden we hit a quarter note, and then we have a blank spot. So, okay, is this just not filled in yet? And no, this is because this lets this section breathe for a second before the entry, allowing the new entry to be more of a fresh start, instead of just occurring throughout a whole run of melodies that keep occurring and never ending. And then now we're back into theme 1 again. We have all these melodies that are going, and then we have a brief pause that you may not actually notice, but it's going to help reinforce a stronger entry when these 2/16 notes come in, and then lead us to the theme now being in violin 1, especially if you're following the theme in each of the voices, it's going to just help that. But now because we have just a quarter note, and then we have a rest here, well, we don't want the listener to think, okay, well now one of the instruments just dropped out, now the other two are playing, but we want them to still be entertained with what's happening with the instruments that are playing. Okay, so you see simply that the cello and the violin are just playing 16th notes for each of the 3 beats. And basically the only thing that occurs above this is the 1/4 note in the beginning of the measure, and then the 2/16 notes at the end of the measure. So now let's look at the notes and the harmony with these 2 measures. Okay, so here we're in G. Our theme was highlighting chord 1, and it's in the cello. It's also acting as a bass because it's lower. So most likely in this case, you're just going to build the corresponding notes of the chord above that. It's a little easier to change the harmonic emphasis when you have the theme, let's say, occurring in one of the upper voices and you're able to put notes below it, because putting notes below something can really change the harmonic emphasis of what's above. But here, the theme is occurring down below. We have chord 1, and we have the same basic thing to where we have a G chord where we have G, D, B. So we have the 1, 5, and 3 going up to the 4th again. Okay, so now we know we're dealing with the chord tones of G, B, and D. Above this in violin 2, we see 16th notes. We see it starts on B, goes up to C, goes back down to B, and then goes to A. So we see the B are the harmony tones. C is acting as a upper neighboring tone, upper auxiliary tone. Those are the same thing. And then we have the A, which is acting as a neighboring tone, linking the B to the G. Okay, and as this is highlighting that note B, this is occurring at the same time that below it we have the note G and D, so the exact notes in the chord that are not occurring above it. So now we have G, B, and D being highlighted just in violin 2 in the cello. Then if we look above that all, violin 1 is leaping up from a D to a G and then to an F sharp. So of course when we're thinking about that G chord, G, B, and D, we see the D and we see the G, and everything is occurring at a good time to where when the cello is starting off in G, violin 2 has a B, and then violin 1 has a D. So we have simply G, B, and D. Then as the cello makes its way to D, violin 2 makes its way back to B, while at the same time violin 1 is going up to G. So again, we have a G in violin 1, a B in violin 2, and a D in the cello. So it's just funny, but whenever you see a chord upside down like this, to where you have G on the top, B in the middle, D down below, you know you have a chord made up of sixths, because instead of each of the note occurring a third apart, it's like the inverted version of that. Now you have a chord consisting of 3/6 with D, B, and then G. Okay, then we see the A and the F sharp are acting as non-harmonic tones. The A is acting as a passing tone, and the F sharp is acting as a neighboring tone. They could both be thought of as dissonant devices within what's going on, or non-harmonic devices, however you want to look at it. Whatever the case is, in this circumstance, it's good to create nice harmony between the voices especially if these are moving together. So as these are moving together, these should create a third or sixth. That'd be the best choice. And we see A and F sharp, we see they're creating sixths. And they're also moving in consecutive sixths with the 16th notes before that. So this helps those dissonances occur as dissonances, but then also be supported harmoniously within that gap that it's acting as a dissonance within the chord. So it's still creating a harmony, and if you think about it, sort of implying a different chord doing so, like we saw before. We have here an A and an F sharp, so you can see how the F sharp and the A are creating that implied possibly F chord, or maybe D chord if there's a D below that. Whatever it is, you can see that relationship between those notes. Moving on, we go to the next beat, which in the cello occurs in the next two eighth notes. So we see that the B goes up to a C, and remember, we're still possibly thinking about the G chord here, because that's what originally we're in the bass voice. Okay, so above that in violin 2, we see the G leaps up to the C, and then that goes down to the B, and then above that in violin 1, we have a G going down to an E. So in this case, if we're thinking about a G chord, we have a G in violin 2, and then we have a G in violin 1. So GB makes sense. And then after this, the cello goes up to C, while at the same time violin 2 leaps up to C. And you might think, oh no, we have direct motion going to octaves, but here we have three voices, so it's not as much of a big deal, and it's occurring in different note durations, so that really helps. If these were all the same exact note durations, and you had this occurring, you may think, okay, you may not want to do that, even with three voices, because it's really easy to follow three voices. But being really easy to follow three voices, we have different note durations here, completely different note durations. So we do have direct motion, similar motion, going to an octave, but in fact, it's not parallel octaves. So I think it's perfectly reasonable. It's just kind of interesting what he did here, actually. And then we have a G going down to the E. So then on this next eighth note, if then we look at where this is, we have a C, we have another C, and then we have an E. Also before this, we just had a G, and then we had another G, and then before that we had a G. So if we put all that together, we see C, E, G, B. So it's kind of like a C7 chord when you combine this all. And okay, if you're thinking very strict counterpoint, how is this justified here? I'm trying to kind of consider that in my mind here, and I'm thinking that this could possibly be justified as an incomplete neighboring tone. To where if we are thinking about a seventh chord here, then we have the G leaping up to a C. Those are both chord tones. So we have a chord tone leaping up to another chord tone, and then it's stepping away from that. And it's also creating that neighboring motion, what seems like neighboring motion, that is leapt to from before, so it's sort of an incomplete neighboring tone. I don't know if that's what he meant to do, I don't know if that's what it's supposed to be, or if that's exactly what it is, but that's kind of what it seems like is what's going on there if I try to justify it in strict counterpoint, being the fact that we originally had chord 1 beginning with, and in the bass the strung part of beat 2 begins on the G, then in the cello the strung part of beat 2, the beginning of beat 2, starts on a chord tone of G with the note B, and of course we have a G above that in both the violin 1 and 2. Okay, so that could be just looking at like a C7 chord there. But then we see on the outside of that an overall basis of what could also kind of function as the G chord. We're starting on the B below, the G above that, and then the G, and then we have the E. But the E could be functioning just as a neighboring tone. If we look at that going to the next beat, the C is leapt to, but then this ends on the B, so we have the G and the B, and that's occurring on the outside of this, so you could still see some of the nature of a G chord, but overall with the leap to the C, I would think of this more as a C7 chord. Okay, the next beat, we have the 16th notes on the bottom. They're playing the notes D, E, D, then C. And originally we were thinking about chord 5 of G, so that would be D. So we do see D is being highlighted. So if we are thinking about D, we see above that, we see in violin 2 an A going down to an F. So we see F and A above the D, which is being highlighted as a chord tone, so DFA, we see that chord there. Then above that in violin 1, we see the F going to G, and then going up to an A. So we see overall contrary motion between basically everything. The cello's going up and then down for the most part. At the same time, the violin 2 is going down, sort of against the beginning of that, but then also violin 1 is completely going up, which is for the most part going against the cello and is completely going against violin 2. So a lot of contrary motion there. And then it's all contrary motion that is starting from and then leading to chord tones of the chord. As the cello starts in D, violin 2 has an A, and then above that, violin 1 has the F. So they're all playing different notes of the chord simultaneously. The 16th notes here are chosen to highlight the non-harmony notes, as well as the harmony notes if they're occurring on the stronger part of the 16th notes, while the 8th notes only have those 2 notes, so those are just highlighting chord tones. So of course the second 16th note here in the cello and then the violin 1 above this, these are both occurring in the middle of the violin 2's 8th note, at the second half of this 8th note. And down below we have a neighboring tone, up above we have a passing tone. So if you have a neighboring tone and a passing tone at the same time, you want a third and a sixth in most cases between those. Okay, so if we look, we have an E and then we have a G above that. So we're just creating a third, and it's, separated by several octaves, but the interval is a third. That's what we're thinking about here. Okay, so that's what we want. We have a neighboring tone and a passing tone occurring at the same time, creating thirds. Then while that's happening, the cello is then going back to highlighting the note of the D. Above that, you see violin 2 has an F, and then violin 1 has an A. So D, F, and A, simple D chord, again, the 5 chord of G major, and then at the same time, this goes down to a C, which is the passing tone, leading us to the next measure. So here we have this very busy moment with the cello and the violin 2, and this has to do with the pause, the breath in the violin 1, and also the shorter note duration of the quarter note going along with that. Okay, so originally this is going to be highlighting chord 1 in G major. Again, the actual theme is starting in the cello here, so let's see if that kept with that, which would be a G chord. Of course, starting in the cello, we have a B, A, G, back up to A. So if it's a G chord, G and B are the chord tones. A is just the non-chord tone, and then above that, we see we're starting on a G. G is moving up through A to B, and this is occurring in contrary motion, of course, because as G is going up to B in violin 2, B is going down to G in the cello below it. So it's a really good thing. You have 2 different notes in a chord, but one of those chord tones travels to the other chord tone at the same time as the other chord tone travels to the other one. So they're flipping places, and they're not only flipping places with a leap here, but we see the passing tones in the middle of that. So it's filled in with notes in the middle. We have that nice stepwise motion of the nice linear run that is highlighting the switching of those 2 chord tones. Again, where G is going to B above, B is going down to G below. Just a really good device to use. You can use this just between chords. So if you have 2 chords, you could do that with the notes between them. You could do that here within a measure with an actual run of notes, with having the passing tones in the middle, and you can get creative with it. Okay, so let's go on to the next beat. Now let's keep in mind this is going to be a bridge from G to C. If you're wondering why I put a 4-1-5, that's just telling us that we have the relationship of the plagal to the tonic, because we had a lot of the 5-to-1 relationship already. We started in G, we went to D, we went back to G, we already had that 5-to-1 relationship, and now we see we're going on the other side of that. So now we're going down the circle of fifths from G now to C. So in relationship to that tonic, the G, the C is the plagal, the 4, the subdominant, and the 5 is the D, the dominant. And of course, subdominant means the dominant below. Hence the word subdominant does not mean before dominant. A lot of people mix up the word subdominant with thinking that it's the chord that should be played before the dominant chord, because it's the subdominant. You play the subdominant, then the dominant, and then you play the tonic. And that's sort of a miscomprehension, because the subdominant is supposed to be the dominant down below the tonic. So instead of thinking of the dominant above the tonic, a fifth above, you're actually thinking a fifth below, which is the 4th scale degree, the subdominant. Same with the submedian, isn't a note before the median, it's the 3rd below the tonic instead of a 3rd above the tonic. Okay, so I think that's just really important to point out. Next beat, we see in the cello the notes of B, C, D, back to B. So it looks like the B and the D are being highlighted, and that C is acting as a passing tone. If we look above that, we see D goes to E, and then F natural back to D. So it looks like basically the same exact thing, but a third above. So instead of starting on B, it starts on D. And with that, now we have all the tones of the chord being spelt out and occurring at different times. So another very clever thing that we can pick up on here. And because those are just placed with the third difference, and they're doing the same exact thing, we know that the passing tone automatically is going to be a third apart. We see the C and an E, a third. Of course, it's all a third apart. So that's a very clever thing there. Because now you have the B, D, and F natural. We have a B chord there, and we have the F natural, which is telling us that, okay, we no longer have F sharp, which was in the key signature and was established in the measure before. Now we're establishing the F natural. We're thinking about C major. Then going on to the next beat, we see the cello has a G, which leaps up to an F natural. So again, we have a leap of a seventh. Strict counterpoint, you might think, whoa, we're doing a leap of a seventh, but this is just something that's going to highlight a seventh chord because you're highlighting the 1 and the 7th degree. If this was just happening in 2 different voices, it's going to be a little different, but here we have 3 voices. We have a lot more of an availability to fill in the notes that'll help create the chord that we want. And then also having 3 different voices and also 3 different instruments even helps more. We can have these occurring contrapuntally to where they're heard in their own separate melodies. Even though these are all 16th notes here, we see a run of 16th notes going all down. On the cello, we have a leap of a 7th, and then we're going down. So you're probably going to be able to pick out that leap of a 7th. It's probably going to stick out, while at the same time, the run of steps here in violin 2 is also going to be very easy just to follow because it's all moving in step. Then we see above that the violin 1, of course, plays these last 2 16th notes. Okay, so as G goes up to F natural, we see above that in violin 2, we see B goes down to A. So again, if we're thinking about that G7 chord, we could see a G, we see a B, and we see the F natural. So G, B, missing the D, F natural. Looks to be like it's like a 7th chord, missing the 5. And then we could look at the A as a passing tone. Then we go to the note G, and as we land on the note G, we're on the 3rd 16th note, and here on the 3rd 16th note at the same time in the cello, we have an E. So now we have an E, G, and that's creating a third with each other. Of course, if we're thinking about a G7 chord, now we see an E and a G, we see something interesting here, but I see he does this a few times, and this is that we see what looks to be a chord tone harmonizing with something that's acting as a non-harmony tone, and then that's traveling in the same direction as something that to where that's going to flip possibly, or depending on where you are in the chord and the notes that you are, they might end up both on chord tones again, like we actually saw a little earlier. Okay, so I like this. It's just very interesting here. We see the E, and we see the G, and we actually see above that, we see a C that's occurring in violin 1. So if we think about that all together, of course, we see a chord of C, E, and G. That's all occurring here on this 3rd 16th note. And then the last 16th note, we have a D in the cello, and then above that we have an F natural, so D, F, we just have a third there, and then above the D and the F, we have a B. So just like before, we have a D, F, and then the B above, so it's like a B chord in first inversion, just like before, it looked like we had a C chord in first inversion with the E, G, and the C above that. So it looks like 2 first inversion chords being hinted at there, both a C and then a B, and that's also occurring in what looks like in the beginning, like what could be a G7 chord, especially because why is the G leaping up to the F? So I think there's some interesting stuff happening here. This is not something that you'd probably do in strict counterpoint. Furthermore, if we're thinking about a bridge from G to C, we see that we have the G5-7 chord being completed here. Since we already had what was kind of like the B chord before, and we had the F natural, and now we have the G and the F natural. So it's like saying, okay, we have this 5-7 chord happening here, which is the 5-7 of C. And then we see that sort of overall C chord and that kind of B chord hidden within there, all at the same time. And of course, the B chord could very well be hidden in there if it's the overall G7 chord, because then you'd have the G below that. So B, D, F, you have a B chord, and then you have a G, B, D, F, you have a G7 chord. Okay, so very interesting stuff happening here. Now we're going to move on to the next page. Keep in mind that now violin 1 is starting with the theme already with the borrowed anacoustic start intro, which is now going to lead us into those eighth notes of theme 1 on the next page. Okay, so here we are on the next page. Violin 1 is completing the theme. Now at this point we've been noticing that each of the voices, each of the different instruments is oftentimes taking its own sort of character. And this doesn't mean that throughout the duration of this entire thing it has a certain character, but in fact what's happening here is that in each measure, the instrument is having its own sort of character. So maybe in one measure, the cello will be moving very quickly, violin 1 will be moving kind of quick in some areas and a little slower in others, while violin 2 is going to maybe be moving slower that whole time. So we have a lot of things like this going on, and the characters are just presented in each of the themes, but as we see, it's all based off of previous material that we heard, or it creates a variation off of what we heard, and when it creates a variation, that's often going to be used as something in this, and then we're going to see that happen later on. Okay, so we already see some stuff right off the bat, recycled and reused. First off, we see violin is doing the theme, and we see the 4/8 notes, followed by the run of 16th notes, and that leads to the other 16th notes. So just like the original theme that we saw the whole time. And we have a slight variation here with the notes, but in fact the only thing that's happening is that before we had the 4/8 notes, which are doing the same thing here, and we have the run of 16th notes, slight variations just going up and down, and then the next run of 16th notes is just going up and down, where before it was going down then up. So the first 16th notes were going up and down, and the second group was going down then up. Now we see they're both just going up then down. Okay, and I'll actually get into what makes the variations slightly different. It's very simple. But then we see something else that's recycled, something else that's reused here. And we see the quarter note, and not only the quarter note, but the breath after that of a quarter note rest and an eighth note rest. Exactly like the rest we had before. Not only with the eighth note and quarter note rest, but the quarter note before all of that, starting in the beginning of the measure. And then after that, we have the 2 16th notes starting with the next theme. So all that is similar and familiar to before. The only thing is that now this whole theme is shortened quite a lot. And that's because already where we have the beginning of the first measure where the theme is beginning, and then originally it went into the next measure. Well, now in the first measure, we see violin 2 is already starting with that entry borrowed from the anacoustic start, which then puts us with the theme now in violin 2. So we already went over this before, but this is the part where we see that now the theme is shortened based on what we had before, to where we still now have a bridge from C to F like I talked about before, and I'm going to talk about the notes that were added just like I've been doing throughout this. But the point of this right now is that we see a lot of familiar stuff. And now that we had this shortened version of the theme appear in violin 1, which played the familiar tonic triad that we knew, where it plays the 1, 5, 3 of the chord, where it starts in the 1 of the chord, it goes down a fourth, and then it goes down a third, and goes up a step. In violin 2, in the beginning of the theme, we see the same thing, where now we're starting in F. We see the F goes down a fourth, goes down a third. That's going to be highlighting the F chord. We have the A, C, and the F. But now, like I discussed in part 2 of this, instead of this going up a step, now this is the part where this leaps up a fifth, and it goes to that altered note, which then tells us the new chord that we're going to be working with. So now this is going to be acting like a bridge note here, an interval, this bridge leap here, where this next section is going to further emphasize the fact that now we are in the B flat, with further emphasizing this E flat note here. Okay, then again, because that is ending so shortly, then at the end of this, now we have the short eighth note pause, and then we have the borrowed anacoustic start, giving us the beginning of the intro, now in violin 1 again. So now it's the part where that beginning to the intro, those 16th notes, are now instead of occurring at the end of the measures, and then the theme beginning at the the theme starting at the very beginning of that measure. Now we have the intro and the theme starting at the very beginning of the measure after an eighth note rest. Okay, so now let's break down the notes that were chosen. So of course these 4 16th notes are going to occur at the same time as this 1 quarter note, and that's going to occur at the same time as these two eighth notes. So not only do we see four completely different note duration choices, creating four completely different rhythms, which is really good, but we also see the fact that those notes combined together are going to create the chord or non-chord tones that we're working with at the time. And again, we're thinking of being in C major to begin with. We started off with the theme highlighting that chord 1, so let's see if we stick with that. The cello has a C going to a D and then an E, going back down to a D, but it looks like the D is just acting as a passing tone going to the next beat. So being chord 1 of C, it looks like we have C and E as our chord tones. Above that we have E in violin 2, and we have C in violin 1. C is then leaping down to a G. While C is leaping down to a G, the cello has a C leaping up to an E. So in both cases you have a C, but they're traveling a contrary motion to two different chord tones in the implied chord at the moment. So now just within that first beat, we have that full chord being implied with the C's, E's, and the G. Okay, now we're on the next beat, and we can see violin 2 drops out at this point to where it doesn't play this beat at all. So now the focus is on the cello and violin 1. One thing that's going to help these lines out that you can see is the contrary motion between them. We see the cello starts with a C, we have a B flat, and then we have an A. So now with the B flat and the cello here, now the bridge is acting more like here because we already have the B flat, we already have the introduction to F major right here. As C makes its way down to A, we see above that an E and then an F natural. So here again we have something interesting. We have a C with an E above it. So we think, okay, C, we have that third. We have what looks like a passing tone of a B and then an A. And then we have an F natural. So if we do put those chord tones together, it looks like we have an F, A, C, and then an E above that. So it sort of looks like we're highlighting an F7 chord here. It actually seems like F natural completes the 7th chord, but instead of being the 7th of the chord, it's actually acting as the very root of the chord. So it's basically turning the triad into a 7th chord. Is that what he meant to do? He didn't mention it. I have no idea. That's what it looks like what's happening here. Okay, moving on to the next beat. We have the B flat still going up to a C. We do have violin 2 at the end of that, so occurring at the 2nd eighth note. But instead, let's look above the B flat for now. While the B flat is occurring as the 8th note, we have these two 16th notes occurring at the same time, and we have a G leaping up to a B flat. Then from B flat, it goes through an A back to G. So we see the G and the B flat acting as the chord tones there, and then at the same time the cello is just holding that B flat for that 8th note. Then at the 2nd 8th note we have a C in the cello. While we have a C, we also have an F natural and then an E in violin 2. And then we have an A and a G in violin 1. And it looks like in both cases where we have the 2nd 16th note, it looks like it could be acting like a neighboring tone. So we have the G in violin 1, and then where we have the E in violin 2, you can see the neighboring motion there. But you also see that he went from a B to a C, and then leapt up to an F that's occurring in the next measure, but he leapt away from this. So oftentimes if this was acting as a dissonance, if this was acting as a passing tone, well, it wouldn't be a passing tone if you leapt away from it. So it makes me think that he's thinking of this harmonically. So if we put that together, we have the C, we have the F natural, and we have an A. So we could see an FAC, an F chord, occurring right there. And then again, we could simply think of both the E and the G as neighboring tones. And we could see with violin 2, the E, and then with violin 1, the G above that is creating a third. So again, we have the neighboring tones occurring at the same time with the same note durations also, and they're creating thirds with each other. Then we go into something similar as the beginning of the last measure, to where we have a quarter note against two 8th notes against 4 16th notes. The cello has the quarter note of an F natural. This is against an F natural and an A in violin 2. So if we think about an F chord, we can already see the F natural and the A. And of course, what would complete that would be a C. So if we had FAC. Above that, we see in violin 1, we see also an A going up to a B flat and then back down to an A. And then that is going to a G, where B flat and G look like they could just be both a neighboring tone with the B flat and then a passing tone with the G. So the chord tones we're looking at are the F and the A here, and we see that's all occurring there on that first beat. We go to the second beat, and we see now, well, we have a trade-off from the quarter note in the cello to now 4/16 notes in the cello, and then after that we do see 2/8 notes. So we see completely different rhythms in each of the beats, and this corresponds very interestingly to what's happening above. Okay, so in the cello we have the stream of 16th notes, and we have an F natural, G, A, back to a G. It looks like, again, the F natural and the A are acting like the chord tones here, while the G are acting just like the non-chord tones. So it looks like we're still working with an F chord here. And then above that, in violin 2, we have an A, and then we have an E flat. Okay, so if we think F, A in the cello, and then we have A in violin 2 now, and then we have E. Well, again, it looks like an F7 chord with the F natural, A, missing the C, and E flat. But then let's look above that in violin 1. Well, we have an F natural leaping to a C. So that definitely looks like an F7 chord spelt out right there. And not only that, but now we have the introduction of the E flat, which is now showing us that we're in B flat major, because we already had the introduction of the B flat before, showing us that we were in F. But then again, like I discussed before, then we end on this next measure here with this B natural telling us that we're actually going to be in G. Okay, but getting a little ahead there, but that's where we're going to be heading up. Now we're going on the last beat of the second measure here, and we see now the cello has 2/8 notes, and we see above this both violin 1 and 2 have 4/16 notes. We just had an F natural before, but now we see an F sharp. F sharp then goes down to D. Okay, and just think, okay, we're trying to get to G major here. So we're introducing the F sharp. Well, now it looks like we're in G major. And this is further implied above, but let's see, we have above this in violin 2, a D, E, D, then C, where E and C look like they could just both be acting as non-chord tones in the implied chord at the moment, or the stronger chord that's being implied in the overall beat. So we have the D occurring over the F sharp and the D. Okay, so we just see the relationship of a third there with the chord tones, and then above that we see a C that's being tied into this next beat here, and it's not only being tied, but then it's being repeated again. So we have a C, C, B natural, and then an A. So now the B natural is telling us that, okay, we no longer have the B flat like we just heard recently right before this. So now actually in this case, I'm going to change this E flat to an E natural here. He didn't originally do this, but I think it's going to further tell us that, okay, we don't have the B flat anymore, we don't have the E flat, and we do have the F sharp. So it looks like, okay, we're definitely in G major now. So now with all those notes combined, the D, F sharp, A, C, we see it looks like a D7 chord. And if we're thinking about the key of G major, then a D7 chord would be the 5/7 of G major. So we see it's keeping with this idea of doing the 5/7 chord of the key that it's going to. And that is acting as the implied chord in the modulatory bridge that is occurring from one key to the next. And the first measure is kind of interesting because we're bridging from C to F. So we didn't do a 5 chord exactly, plain and simple here, just to a 1 chord in F, which would be a C to F, but instead in the key of F, we did a 2 in first inversion on that first 8th note, and then on the second 8th note, we had a 5. So if we simply think F scale degree 2, G, and then a second inversion, so we have G, B, D, now we have B, D, G. And we do see in the cello, we started with the B flat, and then above this, we do go to a G, which then goes to a B flat. But that's good enough because it starts on the third of the chord, so you see that it is inverted, the first inversion, because in the G chord, G, B, D, we're starting with the B. Okay, so that's a trick that Gareth said Bach does oftentimes, and that is the second scale degree of the chord in first inversion, and then it goes to the 5, which then takes you to the 1. So then from there, we're expecting a C, E, and G, and we do see that in the cello, we have a C. In violin 2, we have the F natural, but that goes to an E. And then above that, in violin 1, we have the A, which goes to the G. So if we simply look at the last 8th note, and then the last two 16th notes, we see a C, E, and a G. Okay, I just wanted to go back to that because I saw that I did have a note from what Gareth wrote. And it shows us that, yeah, we actually do have 2 different chords occurring on this one beat. And then next we have the F chord, which we saw that we have the F natural, and then we have the F natural again, we have an A, and another A, we have a C, and then we have an E. So we're looking at an F7 chord. So this wouldn't only be an F7 chord in F major, because now we're in F major here, but this is also the 5/7 of B flat major. So now if we think about this bringing us to B flat major, to where we have the introduction of the E flat, well then that makes perfect sense. The only thing is that then in the next beat, then we have the B natural and the E natural I added, and then the F sharp, which is telling us now G major. So I wanted to go back so I could describe those chords a little more so you get an idea of what's actually going on. Okay, so now that I described those chords, now let's move on to the final measure of this line, and we see that before this we just formed that D chord, and now we're going to G. So that would be the 5 of G, so we have that 5 to 1 again. Now that we're in G, we saw this original, what was a quarter note, now got changed to 2/16 notes and an eighth note. Okay, now let's look at the notes and the harmony. We see the cello has a line that's going up in steps, starts in the G, goes A, B, and then a C. So for now we know the notes G, A, B, C. Let's look at what's above that. We have a B, C, and a D in violin 2. And then above that we have an eighth note rest, and then we have the end of that beat, which we have 2/16 notes of a G and an F sharp. So now that we're in G, we could see, well, simply we could look at this as a G chord. We have all the components. We have a G and a B. Those are occurring on the stronger beats of this row of the 16th notes. Then we have the B going to the D with the C in the middle of it here in violin 2. And then we have the G going to the F in violin 1, where the F could just be a neighboring tone. C could here be a passing tone. And then in the cellos, the A and the C could both be non-harmonic tones, where the A is a passing tone and the C is acting as a neighboring tone. So we see a G chord, G, B, D, but within that we see some notes chosen as the non-harmony tones that actually create a chord of their own. So in the non-harmony tones we see the notes A and C in the cello, C in violin 2, and then F, which is F sharp, in violin 1. So we think of like F, A, C, like an F chord on all of those non-harmonic tones that are harmonizing together here on beat 1. So that's sort of creating an F chord there within the G chord. Furthermore, what's looking like a passing tone of the A forms a C above that, forming a third. Then where we have what looks like the upper neighboring tone of the C in the cello, we have an F above it in violin 1, so it's not creating a third, but we do see that it is creating a neighboring tone, and is creating a neighboring tone in contrary motion at the same time that this is creating a neighboring tone in the opposite direction. So you see that contrary motion. So we see the interval of a fourth. We see something very interesting happening with the contrary motion that definitely helps with the voice leading if you're thinking about following the voice. Of course, we have an interval of a fourth built between the bass and the soprano line, so it's something you're probably not going to normally do. We can see here this actually works out quite interestingly with the two neighboring tones acting in contrary motion of each other, and they're just creating a fourth, which is sort of an ambiguous dissonance, which in some cases can actually not be very dissonant, and in other cases can be a lot more dissonant. In something like this, these are creating neighboring tones, so it's sort of already acting like a dissonance within itself, and then that's creating the interval of a harmonic fourth at the same time. So nothing crazy, nothing super dissonant happening here. It actually turns out sounding quite nice, so very unconventional here, and I think that's great because that just creates different music than you're going to be used to if everyone's following the exact same set of rules that everyone thinks, which I think rules are more of just like guidelines and helpful tips and stuff like that. So I think this is a very helpful tip here. We have the two tones, the neighboring tones, and they are acting like fourths at the moment. But this is happening quickly, and this is already a moment that is considered a dissonant moment of what's happening. Furthermore, like I mentioned, they're both fitting into what could be their own chord tones of a separate chord at the moment. Going on to the next beat, we see the cello has a B, A, B, A. Okay, so let's look at above that. In violin 2, we have a D and a G. So if we're thinking about chord tones here, looks like possibly a G chord, G, B, and D would be those chord tone notes. So let's look above that at these other two eighth notes. Now we have a G going down to a D. Okay, perfect. So G, B, and D, and I'm thinking these are chord tones because we see a leap of a fourth going up, and we see a leap of a fourth going down in contrary motion to each other. So the leap of the fourth is what makes me think that these are chord tones, because I don't think you just take any random notes and do a leap of a fourth. You might, but we can see this is basically all planned out through chords here. And because of that, it's going to make it a very coherent experience for the listener as an end product. Okay, so we see that G chord, which is just the tonic chord there on that second beat, which leads us to the last beat of this line. In the cello, we have a G, A, B, going back to a G. So oftentimes when it's doing that, what it looks like, what it's doing and what it ends up doing is that the G and the B end up being the chord tones as it's going up these steps to this third interval here, and then it's leaping back down to the third, kind of reinforcing the fact that we have the G and the B highlighted here. So above that, we see also a G in violin 2, and then we see violin 1 goes from a B and leaps up to an F natural. So if we think about chord tones here, we see G, B, and then an F, so that could be like a G7 chord with no D. So G, B missing the D, F, which if we're thinking about the scheme that keeps happening here, we see that now we're ending up with a much shorter theme here that's modulating much quicker, and we're already preparing that 5-7 chord, which is just the tonic chord at the moment of what we're using, because we're often going to the next chord that's a fifth away. And we see that this would actually be a 5-7 chord, not of G, but of C, because it is a G chord. Okay, we can also take note that as the cello is having a lot faster of a note duration, and violin 1 is as well. Violin 2 does for the most part, but then here in the third beat, we just have a quarter note. So instead of leaving this as a rest here, at this kind of random moment, instead it's just a different note duration, slower than what we've been used to at the moment, with a quarter note, which is sort of creating a harmonic support of everything else that's happening at the moment. It's not doing anything very much melodically, and in fact it's actually repeating the same note as the eighth note right before it, so it's more so just like harmonic support. It's helping overall with what's happening here, and it's also allowing violin 2 not to just kind of dip out, it's still in there. Okay, now we're moving on to the next line. Now the theme's really easy to spot because we see the introduction 16th notes and the beginning of that theme, and we see now it's jumping between the different voices. It's much shorter now, and now it's occurring only in a single measure before it jumps into the next voice or next instrument. So again, let's just analyze the rhythm here. We see some stuff that's been reused, and some stuff is placed in different areas than we had before, but it's still based off what we had before. So we see a run of 16th notes going to a quarter note. After this quarter note, we see a quarter note rest and an eighth note rest, followed by the entry of the theme again. Okay, so we saw that quarter note rest, eighth note, and then the entry. We saw that, but that was happening in the beginning of the measure. Now it's happening on the second beat of the measure. It's kind of throwing everything off, especially being in a 3/4 time. What this is doing is this is allowing this quarter note pause to then bump our entry of the 2/16 notes to now be the beginning of this measure, while at the same time we have this pause right before it. So we have that pause recycled. It's in a different area. 2 measures before this, we recently had a tied note, so we're going to reuse that idea and do another tied note here. We're not just going to use that one time. And we also see that although this entry had the breath right before it, we have this other entry and we don't have a breath before it. So just something else that's going to throw off the expectations. If you think that you're paying attention, you know exactly what's going to happen, well, now you're thrown off again. But you still get a part of it that you do expect. Okay, so let's get into it. We're looking at the cello, and we're looking at the first measure. We have an eighth note rest, and then we have the 2/16 notes of a C and a B. Above that, we have a single quarter note, so just a single beat, and we have a G. So possibly C and G, creating a fifth right now, or maybe B and G with that sixth. Whatever it is, let's look above that at violin 1. And we see an E going to an F natural, back to an E to a D. Okay, and if we were thinking about C and G, like the fifth there, then we see the E is being highlighted with the notes around it of the F and the D, where F could be acting as a upper neighboring tone, and actually D could be looked at as a lower neighboring tone. So we see the C, E, G, and then we also see that the C goes down to a B, and at the same time while that's happening, then we have the D where this is dipping down here at this lower neighboring tone, and at the same time right before that we had the upper neighboring tone of the F. So if we combine those notes again that are creating those non-harmony tones, we see they create a harmony of their own. We see a B, a D, and an F natural, so just a B chord. So we see a theme sort of happening here to where we're doing similar things in similar places, and we're also doing similar things in similar places when they occur vertically, but then shifting those into different places in the meter, keeping it interesting. Okay, moving on to the next beat, we see the cello has a C, which goes down to a G. Possibly same thing again, we see the C and G relationship above that. In violin 2, we see a G going to an F natural, E, and then a D. So it's all just doing a line of notes. We don't know exactly what's happening here. And then we see that ends on a C. But if we look at the stronger notes of what's happening here, we see a G, and we see an E, and we also see a C. And then we see that with the cello below that, we have the C going down to the G. So it looks like we're possibly looking at a C, E, G again. Above that in violin 1, we have a quarter note of an E. So now I'm thinking definitely, okay, yeah, we're looking at C, E, G. We're looking at a C chord there on beat 2 there. And also those non-harmony tones are just creating a third with each other. So just little touches like that. Like when an artist is doing little touches to a painting, it's what I look at, those little fine details, things like this, like these little fine details that make the overall thing so much better. And of course, that's kind of inevitable doing a run of 4 notes, doing a fourth. Of course, you're going to have that occur as a result, but it's these little things that are just occurring and they're reoccurring, and it's adding these little details, in my opinion. Okay, moving on to the next beat, we see the cello has an E, which is going up to a B flat. If we look above that, we see the notes C, D, and E. So we put all that together, we could see a C, E, G, and B flat could definitely just be a C7 chord, and we see that's a familiar thing where we're creating a 7th chord of the key that we're in, which is taking us to the new key, acting as a 5-7 chord of that new key. So we see a 5-7 of C, C going to F. That makes perfect sense because C would be the 5-7 of F major. So again, we see a similar structure happening here within many things, small things, vertically small details, but also overall things like chords chosen before modulations, and not just the chords chosen, but those chords in relationship to the key that they're in at the moment, which we're seeing is serving much more importantly here than the actual chords and notes themselves. But how are those chords and notes relating to the key that we're in currently, and how does that relate to how chords and notes were relating to the key before? Okay, and we see all the similarities, even though we're going to all these different keys. So all these similar moments now in different keys, and we're hearing these similar things, sometimes even varying, but now going through all these different keys, which is very interesting for the listener. Okay, so now it looks like we're going to F, because we also have the B flat being reinforced here. We have the F naturals, of course, so we're getting rid of the F sharp, but we're not just getting rid of the F sharp and going to C major, but we have the B natural also being reinforced. We go into the second measure of this line, we see a lot of reused rhythmic structures. The 4/16 notes, the 8th note to the 2/16 notes, the 8th note rest to the 2/16 notes. All these things being reused and things being shifted in different places metrically, but all sorts of familiarity still being here. Okay, so starting in the cello, we have an A going to a B flat, back to an A, and then to a G. That's the first beat there. So if we look at the stronger notes of those 16th notes, we see the A. So let's look above that now. We see an F natural, and then that goes to another F natural, just stays, and then that goes to a G. The G looks like it very well could be acting as a passing tone just taking us to this A here. So for now, I'm going to think, okay, I have an A and I have F. That looks like those are my chord tones at the moment. I'm also going to keep those other notes in my mind, thinking, okay, I did see a B flat and also saw a G. Above all this, I see that when I go back to my A again in my cello, and I go to my F again in the violin 2, above this in violin 1, I have an F natural. So it's just creating an octave and an actual octave of the violin 2. It's not a compound octave or something like that when I say actual octave. Okay, so those are right within an octave of each other, and we have the FA relationship. Okay, so it looks like those are just my chord tones at the moment, and maybe that'll get completed in the next measure because we're landing in F major here, and we saw that often we were sort of doing an incomplete version of that tonic on the first beat, but then completing it on the second, maybe third beat. Okay, so let's see. We're thinking we had F, A, we're thinking those are chord tones at the moment. Looking at the next measure, you see the cello starts with an F natural, goes down to an E flat, which takes us to a D, and then a C. Above that, we have a simple quarter note in violin 2 of an A. Now above that, we're looking at beat 2, so these two eighth notes, and we're looking at the notes F and C, and it's being leapt to, so it looks like F and C are probably going to be chord tones in this circumstance. So if we put that all together, and we think that, okay, we're already looking at F before, we have F natural, we have A, F natural again, and then we have that C. So it looks like FAC, but the thing is, where our 16th notes are going, also hit the note D, so it looks like we're kind of doing the same thing again to where we have the FAC triad, and then we also have a note included that sort of hints at this making a D7 chord, but with the D acting as the root of the 7th chord, because we see the D that descended from the F natural before it. So if we look at this and we stack it harmonically, we're thinking D, F, we see an A, and we see a C. Okay, going on to the next beat, beat 3 of measure 2 of this line, we see the cello has a B flat, goes down to an A, G, and then an F natural. And then above that, we see an F and an A, and that's being leapt from the note before, and it's leaping with those two 16th notes. So those look like they're just going to be acting like chord tones. So we see an F and an A, we're going to keep that in mind. And then above that at the same time, we have an A and an E flat. Okay, and we're thinking about being in the chord of F major here. And oftentimes before we go into the next key, we're creating a 7th chord of that key that we're in, which would be an F7 chord, which is going to act like a 5/7 chord of the new key that we're going into. Okay, and we do see all the components that would make that up if we stack this all together. The F natural, the A, the F, the A, and the E flat. And then if we think about these notes here that are occurring around that, so we have the B flat and we have the G. So we could be thinking about the B flat as an accented passing tone, and then the G is acting where it is in 16th notes. It would just be an unaccented passing tone. So it looks like that's all we have, and we can always have accented passing tones. There's nothing new or crazy about that. It's something that's used very often. And then it kind of gives it away also with the leap. So we have the F and the A, and then we also have the A, and then we have the E. And then also the fact that we keep making that 7th chord of the key that we're in, which takes us to the next key. Okay, so all this stuff kind of just points to what's going on here. We go on to the next measure, the last measure of this line. We're almost at the end. And this took a while for me to film. So whenever you're watching a video and it might look like it's an hour or maybe 2 hours long by me, you might think, oh my gosh, 2 hours to watch the whole thing? It probably took me at least 8 hours to film and probably at least 8 hours to edit it. So just keep that in mind. It took a lot of time going into it, and with all the filming and editing, then it turns out becoming a lot more efficient, and you're getting a pretty long lesson confined into a shorter time than you'd probably see if you saw someone live presenting the same exact information without me editing it all. Okay, so editing it all takes out a ton of time. It also takes a lot of time for me. So no, you think, oh, it's 2 hours for you or whatever. It's probably 18 hours or something for me. Okay, so now looking at the first beat of the last measure of this line, we see a B. I added a flat. I think that he meant to put a flat, but he just didn't add it. We had a B flat right before this, and now we're in a new measure, so I'm just going to put a B flat because we're thinking about B flat and E flat highlighted in this measure. Further we get into A flat, but for now we're looking at beat 1. We have a B flat, and above this we have that 8th note rest, and then we have another B flat with the violin 2 going to an A. The A looks like it's acting as a neighboring tone there, so we're looking at the B flat like a chord tone at the moment. This we do see violin 1 has a D, which goes up to an E flat, back to an E, and then down to a C. The E flat as well as the C look like they are just acting like neighboring tones, so the D in this case looks like the harmony tone, and we have the B flat and the D creating a third. Again, just the small detail which is inevitable and is created out of mere product of what's going on, but it's the fact that on those non-harmony notes we also have the C and the E flat just creating a third. Just interesting stuff there. So there's kind of nice things happening in the middle of what's happening as well. And of course, whether we're doing melodic intervals or we're doing descending melodic intervals, our ears are still going to hear those intervals, whether they're going to be within those strong beats or we're going to hear those within the weak beats. We're going to hear all these intervals, okay? So just nice things happening within and without the harmony tones and how it's all adding up together. We go on to the next beat and we see the cello for the next 2 beats is taking a rest. So we're just going to look above that, violin 2 at this point. We have these 2 8th notes, which is beat 2. We have a B flat going down to F natural. Above this we have some 16th notes, and we have a D going to E, F, and then G. So if we think of B chord, we have the notes B, D, and F. We also end back on that B again. So it just looks like a B chord there. Then we go on and we have a D and then an A flat. At the same time, above that, violin 1, we have 16th notes again. We have an A flat going to G, F, and then D. So the D and the A, the 5th leap kind of gives it away. It looks like we're dealing with a D chord. D and A are the chord tones. Then we have the A above, and the only thing missing from that would be an F. And then we see this is going down to an F from the A, and then it leaps down again to a D, reinforcing the D, F, and A. So we see a D chord there. Now if we connect this to the beat that happened before, we saw that we had a B chord. So we have everything making that up. We have the B, D, F. Now if we connect that to the next measure, we have the B, D, F, A. Okay, and as this is going F, D, so all the same notes, and then going back up to an A flat. So we have all these leaping, which is kind of showing us what's going on here. And if we follow the leaps, we have B, F natural, D, A flat. So put that all together, B, D, F, A, we see a B7 chord. Not only is it a B7 chord, but it's not the B7 chord of B flat. We just modulated to E flat with the addition of A flat in here. So right away with the addition of A flat in here, we're already thinking about the 5-7 of E flat, which is going to be a B5-7 chord. And that's exactly what we have here. We have that B5-7 chord, which is then going to take us into the next key. So it's a B5-7 chord going to lead us into the key of, well, into that E flat. Okay, so we're just in E flat because of the addition of this A flat note, which is creating that B7 chord. Okay, we're moving on to the next line because we just had that 5-7 chord we're looking at. We're looking at the introduction into the next theme, and here enough we do have the cello playing that intro to the theme, and then that theme here, the shortened version now, which I talked about in the second version of this video, to where the modulation is now reduced to a simple leap of a 5th from that 3rd of the tonic chord at the moment, which then takes us to a new key, acting as the modulatory bridge, just that leap there to that new altered note. Okay, so, and we're looking at the very end here, so we do see that the rhythms are recycled furthermore. We see the 3 beats of 16th notes, which is recycled from the very first original version of the theme, or at least where the theme ended up in the second measure and then where it led to that modulatory bridge. So we actually have what is originally leading up to the original modulatory bridge, the framework of it at least, in the rhythmic duration. Okay, so then above this we also see recycled rhythms. We see the eighth notes, which is a rhythmic device that was established in the very beginning when violin 2 came in, because when violin 2 came in, violin 1 above it was playing a similar melody. It was playing the eighth note to the 2/16 notes, it had the 2/8 notes, and then a little further we also saw the next variation to where we saw the 2/16 notes and an eighth note, to where we see this is popping up again. And this is nothing more than just a reversed version of the rhythm here, where we have the eighth note to 2/16 notes. Some people might call it a rhythmic retrograde. In music, a retrograde is something that's played backwards. Okay, and then that leads us to the second to last measure, where we see a beat of 16th notes, a beat of eighth notes, and another beat of 16th notes. Nothing new there. The one thing that is new is beats 1 and 2, now in the cello and violin 2, is just a single half note. So now we have a much shorter note duration, 2 times as long as the longest note that we've seen so far throughout this entire thing. And that only occurred minimally, compared to the eighth note, which is what we normally heard throughout this and was sort of the regular duration of the melodic phrasing. Where if we compare this to the eighth note, where the eighth notes are like the slower melodic note durations used throughout this, when we're making melody throughout this, we're oftentimes using the 16th notes kind of as the standard here, but we're oftentimes also using some eighth notes. So that is the faster and slower melodic note durations that are being used here. If we compare just to the slower note durations, the eighth note, well, this is 4 times longer than that. If we compare it to the 16th note, it's 8 times longer. So it's much longer than any other note duration that we've heard so far. And this is helping us to establish the ending. But it doesn't just create the ending, it adds these additional eighth notes at the end, while the run up above is finishing its run with the 16th notes. So it still helps to create a nice melody, and it doesn't just end on chord, 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 but it actually has the melody ending sort of in one voice and then intersects and everything weaves together in the other 2 voices and creates this nice cadence. A very nice ending. We also see I mentioned the eighth notes were something that were used throughout this, so they weren't random when they showed up here. And now that we're looking at these eighth notes, they don't seem random anymore compared to when we're looking at the second version of this video, which included the cadence at the end. Now that we're looking at this with everything that we saw before this, we see the eighth notes are merely a rhythmic device that have been used throughout this whole thing now. The new thing is the half notes, to where we end on 3 half notes, which actually leaves us with a quarter note rest. Now I'll finally analyze these last 3 measures, the notes that are chosen, and then we can finally listen to it all, and then I can have a little bit of fun saying, okay, how can I take this exact thing that he wrote, and without changing anything and keeping this as a foundation, just add things like different dynamics, different articulations for the instruments, and also things like slurring the notes, especially for these bowed string instruments here. That's going to be a big difference, and it's going to be the difference of telling the player if they're going to be doing an up bow or a down bow, and it's also going to basically tell the player how to play the notes. Because if you just write the notes how they are for a string player, that's communicating with the player to play a détaché, which is telling the player to play every single note with a different bow stroke. So every single 16th note is a different bow stroke, and it'll sound like da 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 da, instead of what you might be imagining, like a da 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 da, or maybe a da 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 da. Okay, so whatever you're imagining, you need to slur the notes together to make this happen. I'm going to show this in a second here. But then also with those things I mentioned, also doing things like maybe tempo changes. Okay, so for example, at the moment, this is in Largo. It's putting the quarter note at 50 beats, so 50 beats a minute, or 50 BPM as some people might call it, which, if you think about it, is just under 60 BPM, which would be half the speed of 120 BPM, which is the standard for faster music. But the thing is here that we have all 8th notes and 16th notes for the most part. So I actually chose to put it in a slower tempo so we can pay attention to it more. From Largo, I'll put in something faster, let's say Adagio, and then Andante, and then we'll try Allegro, and we'll compare all these differences and kind of become more familiar with them. These are probably the 4 main tempos you're going to see in most pieces in the common practice period, especially the adagio, andante, and allegro. Those are very standard tempos, but it's good to keep in mind that often tempos between movements don't just go from one tempo to the next tempo. So it doesn't just go from an adagio to an andante. It's not very much of a difference, but it'll go instead from an adagio to an allegro. And then maybe from the allegro, it'll go to andante and maybe have some description on how the players should play it, okay? So the tempo often changes in a way between movements that also creates a dramatic effect or creates contrast between what you heard before. Either contrast or possibly maybe resolution, depending on how the writer scored it. Okay, so now getting into the notes, we see starting on the cello an eighth note rest, and then we see an E flat and a D. Above this in violin 2, we see the note G, A flat, back to G, and then to F natural. Even though A flat and F natural have these accidentals on them, don't think about them any differently than just being notes in a different key. So we have notes in a different key here than the key signature is showing, and we still have an upper and lower neighboring tone from the looks of it. So from what we're looking at, we're also going to make sure this is true, but it looks like the G is the chord tone here. So we have the G. Below we had an E flat, so possibly E flat to G. E flat went down to a D, so D with a G above it. I think it's probably more likely that the E flat and the G are the harmony tones here. So let's see what's above that. We see another E flat, and then we see a B. So if you think E flat, G, and B flat, well, we see an E chord. There's an E chord right there. Notice the steps in the 16th notes, and then also the leap in the 8th notes. So it's not only used in a good area to where the 16th notes traveling much faster are very conjunct, and the 8th note includes the leap, but the leap in the 8th note is actually helping to create a better harmonic structure. Because without it, you just have an E flat and a G and another E flat. You just have a third, you'd have an incomplete chord. The B flat completes the chord and makes it a full triad of E flat, G, and B flat. Going on to the next beat, we have these two eighth notes in the cello of an E flat from before going down to a B flat. So with that leap there, I'm thinking the B flat and the E flat are both going to be chord tones here. So that could be a fifth there. If I'm thinking E without the G, B, so maybe I'm looking for a G here, and that could reinforce that. We look above that in violin 2, we start with a G, we go to A, B flat, then C. Okay, so again, we see G, B flat. So it looks like our chord tones here are E flat, G, and B flat. Above that, we have an E flat in violin 1, going down to a D flat, going back up to an E. So we have that lower neighboring tone, but it's not only a lower neighboring tone, but it is existing below the 1 of the chord, or in other words, it's the 7th of the chord, creating that dissonance there with that neighboring tone. So we're hinting at an E7 chord here. So E, G, B, D, so E flat, G, B flat, D flat. And now with that introduction of D flat, we're all the way looking at A flat major now. Now we go on to the next beat. We see we have 2 eighth notes of a G and a D flat. We again have that reinforced D flat telling us, okay, we're still in A flat here. All the accidentals from before in this measure, of course, are still affecting us now here. Above this in violin 2, we have a D flat, B, G, and F. So it looks like our chord tones there are the G, B, and D flat. So a G chord. Of course, below we had the G and the D flat. Above all this in violin 1, we have an F, D, and a B. So again, a similar thing happening. We have the GBD down below. Looks like, okay, we have a G chord. And then up above, we have F, D, B. So we're completing the 7th of the chord actually. Now we have a G, B flat, D flat, F. So now that we have the G7 chord, we can think, okay, what is that going to be the 7th of? It's going to be the 7th of C major. Okay, so now instead of the G7 chord taking us to C, which with all these flats doesn't make all that much sense, instead it's acting more like a 7-7 chord. So a 7 chord built off the 7th degree of the A flat major, to where you'd have the G, B, D, and F, leading us now into the next measure, the second to last measure. And we already talked about this. We have a Neapolitan chord. It starts with an A flat, goes to a B flat, C, and then back to the B flat. The B flat is irrelevant. It's the non-chord tone. The chord tones are the A flat and the C. We look below this, we have a C in the cello, and then we have an E flat in violin 2. So we have all the notes making up a Neapolitan chord. Then after this, as these half notes are still ringing out, we have the second beat here with these 2/8 notes where we just have an A going to a G, which leads us to an F. So the G is just like a passing tone. The A is passing there too, so it's just passing between here. So you can think of the A flat as still part of the Neapolitan chord. Next, we go on to the third beat of the second to last measure. We have a D that leaps down an octave to another D. At the same time, above that in violin 2, we again have the note D, which steps down to C. So it looks like D is probably a chord tone at the moment. And then above that, we have the F, D, E, back up to F. So if we think D and F, we have D, D, D goes down to C, but then we have F goes down to D, and then it goes back up to F. Okay, so that Neapolitan chord helped us out, because from the Neapolitan chord, we're thinking about that in relationship to G major. So then all of a sudden we put ourselves in G major, and it sounded perfectly fine because we took advantage of that Neapolitan chord, something that's very useful. After this, we then went to the resolution. The cello has a G. Above that in violin 2, we have a B. Then violin 1, we have the G. So between the cello and violin 1, we just have an octave. And then between the cello and violin 2, we just have a third. So we have the tonic and then the third. Pretty simple, but it's effective, especially here in three voices. We don't need to do anything extraordinary and spectacular. And striving for stuff that's too much in three voices can actually take away from what it could be when you're just thinking simply. Here it's pretty simple. We see actually a lot of root position triads here. It's one simple theme that repeats throughout it, that's harmonized with repeated rhythmic and harmonic structures, and the end product is something that's very coherent and has a lot of potential to it. So you could look at something like this and you could further develop it, you could alter certain parts of it and get creative. Okay, so just one of the last things that I want to mention is it's interesting here in the second to last measure that here we have violin 1 playing a lot faster of a melodic line, while at the same time violin 2 and the cello sort of dip out with that half note, and they're basically just holding a harmonic support for violin 1 at the moment, while it goes through basically like a solo line melodically, then leading up to the cadence. And then we need to remember how this started with violin 1 entering. So it's kind of ending similar to how it's starting, and it's giving violin 1 that chance to be by itself and have a solo period where everything then merges back together. So again, there's some familiarity even within that last simple choice of having violin 1 shine at the very end. Okay, so now that we analyzed all this, let's listen to a replay of this, and then we can look at some simple things of how we can take what we already have and maybe just improve it or make it more interesting. Okay, this is the last part of the video. I'm going to first add slurs to the notes, and then from there I'm going to add some different dynamics. From there I'm going to add some accents, kind of just build up, and then we can change the tempo, look at what it's like with different tempos, and then maybe do a tempo change or something like that with all these modulations, add something else that might spice it up a bit. Okay, so first of all, it's good to explain, since we're writing for the string family here, the cello and the two violins, that when we write notes just as they are without any slurs, we're telling the player to play what is called détaché, which means all of the notes are detached, is a way you could kind of think about it. So you can think of détaché, you can think of detached. The notes are detached, so the player's going to play each one with a different bow stroke. So it's going to change bows every time. You're going to have an up bow, and a down bow on these two 16th notes. You're gonna have up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow, and that's what you currently would be telling the player to do. Of course, if you leave it like this for the player, this could just tell the player to play it this way, or the player might choose to add some slurs themselves. Depending on the sound that you're trying to create, you want to be aware of this, so you know when notes are flowing. So you might not want a different bow stroke for every single one. So you might not want a dun 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 dun. You might want the notes to slur together or be played in one bow stroke by the string player. So that's what we're going to first focus on to give the essence of the actual sound that we're looking for and tell the players how we actually want to play it to curate the sound that we're looking for. After that, we have the basis of how we want the players to play. Then after this, I will mark dynamics, which will tell the players to play softer and louder in certain areas, possibly some things like crescendos, where the notes slowly get louder or slowly get softer, decrescendo. After this moment, I might want to make certain moments heightened by adding accents. We'll see if this is necessary. It might be a little too much adding accents because there's already a bunch of fast-paced notes, there's counterpoints, there's these voices you're following. But if we use them in certain areas and then keep using them in those certain areas or in related areas, then that'll be another theme that we could weave into this. We'll see if we're actually going to do this. And then after this all, we can just see what this will now be like with different tempos, because right now it's going to be fairly slow. We can see how it'll be a few steps faster, and then we'll think about maybe a tempo change, and with it being so short, maybe we'll just add the tempo change at the end for the cadence. Okay, so let's get into it. First, we're going to start slurring the notes. We have the anacrusic start in the beginning, so instead of that being two separate bow strokes, which would be very quick, I think it would be better just to slur those two notes. So I'll try not to do this too much, but just for now, we'll see what it sounds like now with it slurred, and then we'll just compare without it being slurred for these two notes. It doesn't really sound much different, and that's because of MuseScore here. The playback already makes the notes sound like they're kind of slurred already, so adding the slur doesn't do very much. But we'll see if we start slurring these eighth notes and other parts where we have these different rhythms. It will sound different if we start slurring things, but MuseScore already makes it sound like it's slurring a bit already, so you don't actually get that detaché sound of each separate bow stroke that you would if you handed this to a player normally in real life. So that's something really good to comprehend. I think you can put this into different programs with different sound packs or something like that, or I think you can even download certain sound packs or whatever here on MuseScore. I haven't quite done that yet, but I'm looking forward to some point doing that, to where I can just write what I actually want to write and then actually hear what it would sound like if a player sounded it with the détaché bowing. Okay, so for me, didn't sound much different, and especially because of these 16th notes and the way that MuseScore plays the notes, it basically just sounds like they're slurred together already. I'm still going to add the slur there. But here's a trick that some people do in MuseScore to make it sound more like détaché bowing. And this is adding tenuto and staccato at the same time. If you notice, the eighth notes basically sounded like they were slurring as well. So now let's listen to this, and then we'll compare it to the difference without this. Okay, so as you see, it definitely made them seem more detached, and it wasn't just staccato though. So the staccato and the tenuto helps make it sound more like détaché here in MuseScore, so I'll use that to my advantage. Okay, so looking at this first line here, here's what I did. I wanted to make the meter very apparent, the 3/4 meter that we're using here. Okay, so let's look at what I did to slur this top line here. I wanted to keep the time signature very apparent. We're using a 3/4 time, so I wanted to show that in the meter here by slurring the notes accordingly. We have the first two eighth notes slurred, the second pair of eighth notes slurred, and then we have the row of 16th notes slurred on 3 of the notes. One of them isn't slurred, so there's a lot of reasons why I did this the way I did. So most of the time as a composer, it's not going to be your duty to actually mark the bowings for the player. Okay, so if we look at the line down below, it's just an example here for now. It's not your duty to say, okay, we're going to have a down bow, up bow, and then a down bow. But as you can see, I'm implying that with the slurs already. So you do want to imply to the player, okay, I want this group of notes slurred, I want that group of notes slurred, and in between this, we're going to be shifting the bowings. And this will be your understanding, at least, but just know that the players might change it to be played differently to make it more idiomatic for the instrument and to make it sound more like you actually want the end product to be. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of those again. That was just an example, but if we look above, this sheds light on why I slurred the notes the way that I did. I'm thinking that in the beginning of the first measure, I want a down bow. So in the anacrusic start, if I had an up bow right before that, that would prepare this nicely. So in this circumstance, if I did something like this, and on the anacrusic start, mark the up bow, and then mark the down bow here in the first measure, well then that's going to communicate to the player what I want to do right off the bat, and then with the slurring, they're going to be able to make sense of this. So doing this would be perfectly appropriate, but marking the up bows and the down bows every single time is something you should stray away from. If there's very important moments, like here in the beginning you're saying, well, I want to really let the player know that they're starting with that up bow and then the down bow actually on the beginning of the measure, well, this would be an important moment that it would be good to communicate that with the player. But other than that, you should be able to communicate that with the slurrings that you're doing, and with that, think about it consciously when you're slurring things, that okay, I want to make sure to have these up bows and down bows in certain parts, and think about this. Okay, and be aware if you're scoring something like here on MuseScore and you're listening back to it, you're not going to hear all those up bows and down bows and the emphasis of that like you would in real life. So you can't just slur a bunch of things and then listen to a playback like something here and then think, okay, it sounds a certain way, and then give it to a player and then realize, okay, it's going to be completely different, and they might remark all your slurrings and whatnot to actually make it make sense for the meter and the sound of the piece and whatnot. You don't want a player to go through that, and they probably wouldn't want to play your piece if they would have to do all that in the first place. So if you learn how to write in a style that is actually playable, then you could play it here and listen back to it, and then you could give it to a player in real life, and you could have it perform possibly. Or if you were trying to do something like write music for a movie or something, well, if you learn how to write music for instruments, well, it's probably going to sound a whole lot better if you hired or had someone who hired a group of musicians, a chamber ensemble, or maybe something kind of like a big deal, and you have a whole orchestra or something, and maybe opera singers or something like that. Maybe a choir section. Okay, so that's why it's really important to be able to learn how to write for things that will actually be idiomatic in real life, so then you don't give it to players in real life and they say, okay, I kind of see the idea, but they have to kind of work around how to actually make it possible. A good writer will be able to write music for a player, and the player will be able to read it and know exactly what to do. This isn't to say that some composers leave stuff a little bit vague in order for the conductor, arranger, or the group, the ensemble, to actually make their own outlook on the piece. People like Beethoven often did stuff like this, but nonetheless, he still wrote in a way that was perfectly comprehensible to the players, to where they wouldn't have to edit a bunch of things. They could just take the template of what he wrote, and then they could build off that. So that's a little bit different there. Okay, so let's look at why I slurred these notes the way that I did. So the very beginning two notes, the anacrusic start, we see I marked it with an up bow, and then in the first measure, we see I marked this with a down bow. To think of a down bow, to remember that, just think of a staple. Like you have to press a stapler down to staple a piece of paper, and look at the down bow, it just looks like a staple. So just think of, you have to press it down, it's the down bow. So process of elimination, when you see the V, you know that's the up bow mark, because you only have one or the two. You have the up bow, you have the down bow. Okay, after this, we see that the first two eighth notes are slurred. Then after this, the next eighth notes are slurred. And then the first 3 16th notes are slurred. So if we're thinking about these up bows and down bows here, let's just follow that and see what I did. So we have up bow here with this slur, down bow, up bow, down bow. And then since I left this last note by itself, we have the up bow here. And then starting on the next measure, on the down beat, on the strong beat, we see there's a down bow. This might be a little boring if we're just thinking, okay, we have all these 16th notes and we're just going to be doing down bow for 4, up bow for 4, then down bow for 4. So to just make it a little more interesting and also add some symmetry, we see that in the middle of this, I slurred a group of 2 16th notes and then a group of 2 16th notes. And then on the other side of this, again, we have those 4 16th notes slurred together. So we see that symmetry within that whole measure there. And then also at the same time, now we added a sort of rhythmic device. We already added a few here. So if we look at this measure, we have these 2 16th notes grouped together, and that's a slur. So that could become a rhythmic device here, just slurring 2/16 notes together. We could use this throughout this. And we see we already started using this here, where violin 2 comes in and is making the entry for the theme in violin 2 with those 2/16 notes. Those two are slurred together, which is basically just repeated from these two being slurred here. So again, with the slurring technique, I'm going to be adding these familiar moments and also in similar places. Back up to the measure before this, we see since I slurred these 3/16 notes and left this 1/16 note free here at the end of the beginning of the theme, well, that's something I'll take note of and I'll make sure to also add later on. And then I separated these eighth notes with a group of 2 and 2, so it emphasizes the beats more, beat 1 and 2. So also take note of that, and I'll add that later on as well. And since this doesn't just keep repeating the same theme, and remember the theme gets shortened and altered and varied, because of this, when I start using these in the same places, it's not just going to be redundant and boring, because we're going to see these familiar things happen in different parts of the meter, in different keys, and it's just going to add to the musicality of it, having these repeated little moments like this. Okay, so now we're going to be thinking about up bows and down bows of two different instruments here. So probably good just to think about one instrument's line at a time. I'll finish that since we only have 2 measures on each line here. And the next page we have 3 measures. So since these lines are really short, I'm just going to do one instrument's line at a time. In real life, if you were scoring something and you had a lot more measures per line, maybe you just do a section and then move on to another section, but it's probably going to get complicated if you start thinking about doing the up bows and the down bows for both of the things at the same time. In life, I find it's a lot easier just to do one thing at a time. I'll focus on the violin, I'll get it done, I'll finish that, I'll move on to violin 2. Oftentimes when I use this method, I save a lot of time versus saying, okay, I'm going to do violin 1 and 2 at the same time, and I'll try to save time, and then I end up being confused, making a mistake, or getting a headache, and then you waste time. Okay, so with that, we're going to refresh violin 1 up bow and down bow, and then we're going to move on to the next line here, and we're going to see how we're going to mark this, also remembering how we marked the slurs before. Okay, so violin 1, again, we have the up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow. The up bow prepares us for the next measure. We have a down bow with these 16th notes, and then with these group of 16th notes, this makes it a little different here, but how this all works out, we have the first group, down bow, and then up bow with this last group of 16th notes, which that up bow prepares us to land on a down bow here on the beginning of this measure here on this line. Okay, so now we have that in mind. We have a down bow here. Up above, we separated those eighth notes to emphasize the beats. So now it's good to think simple, but you can also think too simple, okay? And if we think, okay, we're going to emphasize now beats 1, 2, and 3 with violin 1, because if we look at the violin 1 and violin 2, we see that the rhythms are distinctly different in their own. Violin 1 has the 8th note, 16th notes with the 8th notes, and the violin 1 has the 8th notes in the beginning and then the 16th notes. So we have things at different times. So if I just slur everything accordingly, keeping in mind I'm going to keep the theme where it's now in violin 2 just like it was when it was in violin 1 with the same slurrings. Well, we see this could be rather boring to start off with, just doing it this way. It may not give a chance for the 16th notes to shine as much as they could, and all this at the same time as not really keeping the same bowing scheme. It's where we have the down bow on the first beat of the measure. Of course, we start on the down bow, but if we have a down bow, up bow, and down bow ending on the down bow, then we're going to start on an up bow in the next measure. Well, this might actually be interesting, and if we did this, then this could be something we might want to repeat later. But in fact, I don't think this is a good moment for doing that. It's the very beginning, and it's just the second line, and we're just hearing the theme coming back in violin 2. It's repeated exactly the same as it was in violin 1 up above, but now it's just in a different key. So with that, I'm not going to try to alter a bunch of stuff. Okay, so with that, I'm going to get rid of these slurs on the 8th note, 16th note pairings. Both these 2 8th notes, I'm going to keep the slur. I might get rid of the slur depending on what I actually want to do, but I'll leave it as a marker. Okay, so let's think about what I could do with these 8th note and 16th note pairings. So now let's see what I did for the next line with violin 1. I decided to slur the pairs of the 16th notes and then keep the 8th notes free. And if we follow the pattern starting on the down bow and keeping in mind that for now I also want to keep the down bows on the first beat of the measures. Let's see what happens. So we start in the down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow on the next measure, up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, preparing us for the next measure. So then we're going to land on a down bow here in the violin 1 on the next measure. We also see that I didn't keep it simple to the fact where I just slurred every beat together, but instead I have a repeating pattern here, and it also helps the 16th notes stick out, and also helps the 8th notes stick out. And having these 16th notes slurred just helps them act a little more smooth, and then it adds to the contrast with the 8th notes surrounding it, since those are not slurred. And then on top of that, it keeps a similar pattern, and then also creates a new pattern. Since these are new notes here and a new rhythm, and this is written on top of what we already heard before, then this is getting treated with its own rhythmic style, to where we have slurs that are different than what we saw before, but it still is based on what we saw before, because all that I did was slur these two 16th notes, and we see that's something that I was already introducing before as a rhythmic style. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind. We have the slurred 16th notes, we have the 8th note to the slurred 16th notes, that's another thing, and now we also have two 8th notes not being slurred as another rhythmic device. And all this is still emphasizing each beat, but it's adding a little more character to the line. Okay, now that we did this, we're going to look at violin 2. And should I mark the up bow and the down bow here on violin 2? Well, it's already pretty obvious what you want to do. You probably don't need to at all. It might be a good idea just to do it this one next time, to say, okay, every time we have this entry, then that's going to be an up bow to the down bow, where the entry leads to the beginning of the theme. So if we do it one more time, it's just going to finalize that, okay, this is what we really want to do. It might be a little too much TMI, but you especially don't want to keep doing that every single time. So you don't want to keep marking all these up bows and these down bows every single time that we have a similar moment. Okay, so I added the up bow and the down bow, but remember, it's not our job to be adding these up bow, down bow marks. So if we think about this further and we start thinking, okay, well, each player's probably going to have their own separate sheet of paper. They might have the full score on that. Oftentimes, they'll just have their own instruments line. And with that, you might be thinking, okay, well, now I should start marking the up bow and the down bow for the cello as well, so they know. And you might start getting in a pattern where you think about doing all these up bow and down bow marks. But remember that if you're going to have this actually played by people, that if you give this to an arranger, conductor, or the librarian, one of those people are going to be adding these up bow and down bow marks, to where somewhere along the line, the players are going to be able to play this correctly. If you give this to, let's say, a chamber ensemble, then you might have the group working together to mark the up bows and the down bows, instead of having the conductor or the arranger do that for them. Okay, so I think we've given enough information to tell the players that the next time when we have this 16th note entry for the theme coming back in the cello, we're already going to know that if we slur this the same exact way, that we're going to have the up bow going to the down bow. And then how we slur everything after that is just going to further tell us and communicate with the player the up bows and the down bows. So we don't really need to mark any more up bows and down bows unless there's a very specific moment that you think, okay, I really want this to be this certain bow direction for a certain reason, and I don't think the player's going to know that at all. So in that case, it'd be perfectly reasonable to mark that bowing, but just don't be surprised if you do mark some bowings and they completely get changed, and maybe even your slur marks get altered as well. If you're a beginning musician, beginning composer, this is something that you're probably going to expect. That the players are going to read what you wrote and they're going to fix it to make it more playable for them, more idiomatic for their instrument, and also give the sound that you're looking for, that the piece is intended to sound like. So if this does happen, and if you get a score back from players and it has markings on it and they fix things and they change things, pay really close attention to that and learn from that. Okay, so now this is pretty easy because we have the returning theme and it's marked exactly the same, and to keep things consistent, I now have these slurs going in certain places here with the theme, and I'm just going to do the same thing here now with the theme now in violin 2, now in a different key. Okay, so I slurred it exactly the same. I could have differed something and said, okay, maybe I want the two slurs to happen here on these group of 16th notes, and then have two groups of 16th notes slurred after that. But not only does that break away from the symmetry in this measure, but it breaks away from the overall symmetry in both the measures combined. As we see on the outside of the violin 1, we have the same 8th note and 16th note combinations. Violin 2, we have the same 16th notes slurred together the same way, so there's that symmetry there in both the outer parts. And then in the middle part, we have the violin playing 2 8th notes, not slurred. And here in violin 2, we have the 2 16th notes slurred in 2 different pairs. So that's basically emphasizing both of those 8th notes. But not only that, but also filling in some notes in the middle, so it helps it stick out on its own. But we see how there is symmetry in what is going on, reusing ideas from before, but they're also now responding to each other and relating to each other in certain ways. So now before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's just familiarize ourselves with what's going on here and listen to it. First, we'll listen to Violin 1 isolated from where we've scored it so far, and I'll end it up until this next line here, and we'll do the same thing for Violin 2 and show where it starts isolated, and then I'll play both them together so we can hear them together just for now. Okay, so here's Violin 1, and then 2, and then them together. Okay, so we can see that slurring the notes gave each line its own identity rhythmically. And then as the Violin 1 went into its different new rhythm, that sort of gave it a new character. And then we heard Violin 2 with the similar slurrings come in, with kind of a similar character as the line above it, where the theme was originally in Violin 1, since those are both slurred the same way. So it maintained a character even stronger than how it was originally scored, now that we have these similar bowings. So you might notice that where I didn't slur the notes, where I was explaining is going to be the détaché bowing, is going to be a note with its own bow stroke, then I didn't put the tenuto and the staccato above it. Okay, so you might be wondering why I didn't do that. If I was explaining, it helps with it being the détaché sound, and that's because, well, I did try it out, and it definitely did make it sound more detached, but it didn't fit in, and it sounded kind of awkward here in the placement. It sounded much better when I got rid of it, and actually had a smooth effect here with how I slurred it. So I think that would be useful not in just a note before another note when everything's surrounded by more slurs, especially with the 16th note, but I think it would be more useful for, let's say, if we actually had a moment where there was a bunch of 8th notes or something, and we had decided to do a bunch of those tenuto staccatos, really emphasizing the detached nature of those. So this piece is very short, since it's just a sort of example piece with the beginning, and it leads to the ending with some modulations and whatnot. So it might not be practical to start doing something like that here in this piece because it's rather small, and like I was mentioning, it's good to repeat something at least 3 times if you are going to do it. But if we started doing that, we see we don't have a lot of moments where we just have 8th notes by themselves, and if we were to repeat that 3 times, then we wouldn't be repeating what we had before. So we could see if that'll make sense, or if it might make more sense to keep things familiar to how they were before. Okay, so now let's keep going. For now, since the theme is coming back directly the same in the cello as it was in Violin 2 and Violin 1 in the beginning, I'm not only going to keep the slurs the same to how they were before and with the other notes corresponding to that, but I'm also going to keep in mind that for this moment, I want to have the down bow on the first beat of each measure, at least leading onto this first measure here of the next page, to now where we start getting variations of the theme, to where I might do variations of the bowing scheme, which then again, if I do a variation of the bowing scheme, I'll make sure to now have that as a theme that'll pop up in similar areas where we have the similar varied areas of the theme. Okay, so now we're looking all the way back here at the cello, and of course we know what to do here now. I'm just going to slur those 2 notes. Since we already had the up bow and down bow marked twice for the same exact theme, that's going to be slurred exactly the same Now who's ever reading this is going to say, okay, we know what's going to happen here. The cello is going to start with an up bow, and they're going to go here to a down bow on the next line. Okay, now I filled in the next line here. Let's look at what I did. Of course, with the cello, I did the same exact thing with the theme. The two eighth note groupings are tied together, emphasizing the beats. The 3/16 notes are tied together with the 1/16 note not tied, which just helps with that bowing scheme. So now we have that down bow on the next beat, and it's just identical. So we have the 4/16 notes slurred, and then the grouping of the 2/16 notes slurred in pairs, and then again 4/16 notes slurred. So to correspond to that, I wanted to make what was above it different. I also wanted to remember that since I have the entry of the theme going in the next measure, and since for now everything is exactly the same, it's unaltered except for the fact that it's just existing in new keys. So like I was saying, I want everything, at least for now, to stay the same, at least until it gets to the next measure where the themes start to vary rhythmically. So with that, I want to slur these 2/16 notes, the entry to the theme. Because of that, that shed light in the fact that, okay, I have these 4/16 notes tied together, and I have these 2/16 notes tied together. So this shows how sometimes you work backwards in music as well. So for this line now, I'm working backwards. I'm just slurring the notes, but this is how I did it. So then I thought, okay, what can I do with these notes here, with these 16th notes? And I thought, well, what happens if I repeat the pattern that the theme does in the first measure, in the last beat of the first measure here? So where we have the 3/16 notes tied together with the 1/16 note not tied. So I did that here in the last one, and I thought, well, because of the symmetry, I also want to do that in the first one. If you look below that, here's where we have the symmetry with the 16th notes in the cello. So since I wanted to keep that symmetry again, like I did above in Violin 2, same thing, in this area where I had the symmetry, I also kept the rhythm above it symmetrical around it. So I was thinking in similar terms, and I was thinking, okay, so I at least want these outside to be slurred. I also want it to start on a up bow, and I want it to end on the down bow. So I followed everything, and I thought, well, what if I slurred these three in the middle as well? I don't really want to do that, but everything worked out fine, and we had the up bow on the last note. But if I got rid of those slurs and just left these 16th notes by themselves, well, now it's going to stick out a lot more compared to the 16th notes below it that are grouped in the two pairs, and we're not just going to have the same thing repeated on the three beats, where we have the 3 notes slurred and the 1 note not slurred. So already we're going to add some more interest, it's going to stick out more, and we're going to have a new rhythmic pattern here where we have 4/16 notes not slurred at all. Now this is something that we can make sure to introduce later on this next page. And this is going to be perfectly fine, because if we look on the next page, we see plenty of times where we have moments of 4/16 notes. So that's going to be no problem. We also want to pay attention that the 4/16 notes occurred in a very specific moment. They occurred in the middle of the measure, in that middle of the symmetrical measure, to where it has below it the two groupings of the 16th notes. So whatever it is, it's existing in the middle of a measure where what's surrounding it is symmetrical. So we could think about it like that if we want to use it later, but things are shifting rhythmically and the themes are varying. So maybe we want to think simpler and think, well, we have these 4/16 notes existing by themselves with no slurs above where we have the 4/16 notes grouped in the two pairs. So we could just think about that relationship. Even if we had those 2/16 note pairs up above, we could still think, okay, well now below that we could have the 4/16 notes without slurs. So we might want to use it in that moment, but as we look on the next page, that might not exactly work out how we want it to. So we're going to have to get creative here. And then if we look in the first measure of this line, of course we already know what the cello's doing, that's just repeated from before. And also Violin 1 now is just doing the same rhythm we already saw before, with the 8th note, 16th note pairs on either side, the 2 8th notes in the middle. And that's just still maintaining the same rhythm that was occurring before with Violin 1. That's just existing over what was the theme in Violin 2, but now that rhythmic theme still keeps going in Violin 1, but now the theme is in the cello. Okay, so of course I slurred everything exactly the same as we see in the measure before it. So we're recycling these slurring patterns. Then below it, I just combined and reused multiple things, all while keeping in mind the up bows and the down bows, all while at the same time trying to have the instrument have its own rhythm. So we see how it's corresponding differently to the notes above and below it. So I chose to slur these 3/16 notes here for Violin 2, and if we see where that's occurring metrically with the notes around it. It's doing its own thing metrically. Also below we have the 2/8 notes tied, so that's just one beat. And then in violin 1, we have the 8th note going to the 2/16 notes, and the 8th notes not slurred at all. So each instrument is rhythmically doing its own thing. Furthermore, if we look at this 8th note of the cello, the 2nd note of beat 1, if we think about this metrically and rhythmically and we look at the notes above it, violin 2 has these 2/16 notes and they're not slurred. But above that, violin 1 has 2/16 notes as well, and they're moving in the same direction, but now these are slurred. So these little things are just going to help each of these instruments stick out on their own even more. Furthermore, we go on to the next beat and we see the 8th notes slurred in the cello. We see violin 1 also has 8th notes, but they're not slurred. Furthermore, they are traveling in contrary motion, which just helps them be their own isolated line even more, helps with the voice leading. And then in the middle, violin 2 has its own rhythm where it has the 8th note going to the 2/16 notes. And the 8th note being separated and the 2/16 notes being slurred also helps this stick out on its own. And we also see the 8th note traveling in contrary motion to the 8th note in violin 1 above it, to where these are both not slurred. That's going to help these stick out, as well as the 2/16 notes in place of the 8th note. So all these little details are going to add up and help us hear each one of these and be able to follow them. Especially being 3 voices, it's a lot easier to follow. Once you start getting into 4 voices, it becomes a lot harder to follow, but harmonically you can do a lot more stuff with 4 voices and you can have a much more complex end product. But if you're really trying to have lines stick out on their own, a 3-voice texture is very good for that. And not only that, but you can do 4 voices where you can have a 3-voice texture with an accompanied bass line below that, and this can be very effective. You can still have the 4 voices. You can now do more harmony with 4 voices, but the 3-voice texture serves as a lot more easy to follow, with the bass line accompaniment also serving as its own thing, being easy to follow as well. Okay, so that line is done. I'm going to move on to the next page. I'm going to complete the rest of the slurring now. Then we'll give it a listen. We'll listen to everything. So now the second page is done. Let's look at what I did. So for the most part in the beginning, I just reused things that were from previously, because I was thinking, okay, so in the beginning here, we're still thinking that we're leading up to the same things. From before, we kept having the theme just being restated in the different instruments, and we're leading up to that again, so we just expect that to happen again in violin 1. Therefore, I kept the slurring the same for this measure, so you kind of expect everything to be the same. The 2 groupings of these 8th notes is borrowed from the theme that happened originally, along with the 3/16 notes, and with the one that's not slurred, just like before, and that's for this measure. And we also see the 16th note entry that I kept slurred, and we see down below all of this, where you see this exact rhythm and slurring scheme here in the cello, found in the 2nd violin 2 measures before. It's just in a different key, and now there's a slight variation to it. But for now, I kept the slurring exactly the same. You might notice the middle rhythm did flip though. It's where instead of an 8th note to 2/16 notes, now you have 2/16 notes to an 8th note, but I still slurred it the same way. After this, I kept all of the quarter notes not slurred, except for the one tied that you see that was already in the original response. But other than that, all the quarter notes exist by themselves, so they really emphasize that beat. Since we have the theme ending and the bridge here, with the intro and the theme starting really quickly, again already in violin 2. Well, now I'm slurring that same way, where I just have the group of the 8th notes slurred together, and then that group of the 16th notes has 3 slurred and 1 not, just like before. So everything is slurred similar now, but now things are all changing. The themes are getting compressed. Then if we look above this, we see these 16th notes grouped, and this plays off 2 things. One, the grouping of the 2/16 notes that keeps repeating already. So we're already used to seeing these 2/16 notes grouped together. They're also a step away, which we keep seeing that also adds to it. But also the second thing is we've already seen this slurring rhythm before, where we see the 2 groups of the 16th notes. So it's just occurring in a different place metrically now. This is a little different because we have this 8th note that's tied then to this next beat here. So of course that's already within the response, so I kept that how it was, and I responded to that with the different rhythms below. You can see while all this is happening, I chose to keep these first 2 16th notes not slurred, and then I slurred the last 2 16th notes. I think it's a very appropriate time to do this because the themes are varying so much and getting crammed so much, and we've already now seen 16th notes by themselves with no slurs. There's nothing new happening here with that, and it's just kind of shortened compared to what was before, which also fits the theme of the themes being shortened. But I did keep the last two slurred, which is different than all the rhythms that are happening above it. We go into the next beat, we see I have two eighth notes not slurred, and again this is different than everything above it as well, and violin 2 and violin 1 are different from each other, to where violin 2's third beat you see the first 3 16th notes tied together, the last one not, so it's a rhythmic device we keep seeing with the slurs there. Above that we see the 2 16th notes not slurred, and then we see 2 16th notes after that slurred. Okay, so that just happened the beat before it in the cello, so now we're already reusing that simple idea, which is kind of a few ideas shortened, which, like again, fits the theme of what's happening here, with the actual theme being shortened and all that. Okay, so now going on to the next measure, we see again just a simple theme of slurring everything to where it is different. But keep in mind that I kept the down bows and the up bows consistent throughout the whole thing. There's always a down bow on the first beat of each measure, and every single measure also ends on an upbeat, preparing you for that next downbeat. All except for one moment here, which I marked and I'm going to talk about in a second. But here we are in the next measure here, the second page, top line, third measure, and in the cello we see these 3 16th notes tied together, the 1 16th note not tied. Okay, that's familiar, we've heard that a lot, but that's also helping the fact that we have these 2 16th notes tied together and this 8th note not tied. Well, that's also something that we've heard many times as well. So these ideas are just being recycled, but they're being used against each other or with each other to create the distinction between each melody and each instrument even further. Furthermore than that, where we have the 2 16th notes going to the 8th note not slurred, and then we also have these last 2 16th notes not slurred in the cello, well, above all this in violin 1, we have these 2 16th notes slurred, and this is also the entry to the theme in violin 1. So it's all working out, and it's all being repeated from what we had before. We always have these 2 notes slurred for the entry, and it's just like before. The only difference is that we're used to having these 2 eighth notes slurred in the theme, and that keeps happening every single time since the very beginning. But now we have these 2 eighth notes not slurred and the last 2 slurred. And again, I think this is a very appropriate time, because if you view what is going on with the melody, then you'll notice that things are changed here. It's varied. Instead of going down a fourth and then down a third and then up a step, which is what happened throughout the entire piece, now it's going up a fifth. Now it's varied. And actually did vary in the measure before. So it varied here, but then in the next measure, I changed a different bowing scheme, a different bowing pattern with how I slurred everything. And you'll see in the next measures that I kept that. So I did keep that idea, and I repeated that actually 4 times, as you'll see. So okay, back to this measure here, we see the next beat, we have these 16th notes completely détaché. There's no slurring on them. We already heard that occur before, so that's not anything new. Also, when that did occur before, that was surrounded by the grouping of the 3 16th notes with the 1 not slurred, and that happened on both sides with that symmetry. And we see again that same exact thing is happening. The bowing scheme is identical to what we had before, so it's all very familiar. While on beat 2, these 4 16th notes are completely isolated, we see above that 2 eighth notes which are slurred. It's always nice slurring 2 eighth notes. And then on top of that, in violin 1, we have 2 eighth notes not being slurred, and these are also traveling in contrary motion to each other, the eighth notes in violin 2 and violin 1. So everything again is doing its own thing rhythmically. We go on to the next beat. Again, we have those 3 16th notes slurred, the last one not. Above that, we have the quarter note all by itself, just emphasizing that one beat. It's just one note for the whole beat. And then above that, we have 2 eighth notes. So no matter what we do, these are all completely different note durations, and this will probably stick out well on its own, but now we're sticking with a bowing pattern, keeping it consistent or varying it, and then keeping that consistent. And again, this is adding to the musicality of everything, because there's reasons why we are doing everything, and it's based on stuff we already heard. And as we know, music is an experience that exists right now. Everything exists now, but for a song to be musical and for a song to actually be a song at all, well, we need to have memory of it. We need to remember what we just heard, what we heard a minute ago, what we heard 5 minutes ago, and relate that to right now. That is the musical experience. So it is all based off memory and remembering what we heard before. So we're playing off that here by adding a lot of familiar things and repeating certain things in certain areas, but we're also getting certain familiar things and then also putting those in some different areas now that the theme and everything else is kind of varying and going different areas. It kind of all plays on each other, but when we have similar note durations and similar things happening, we still have these same similar bowing schemes. Okay, so now going on to the next line, we see we have a rest in the cello, which helps there's no notes happening here. And then we have these 2/16 notes slurred. And of course, this is exactly like we had before. And then I want to keep these next 2/8 notes the same as the measure before, to where these two are not slurred, but the next two are. And it's also going up that fifth to the new altered note, changing you into that new key. Up above in the violin is different, and we haven't really seen something exactly like this yet. And I mean, especially with the quarter note tied to the first 16th note, then going down. So that tie kind of changes the bowing a little bit there. So with that, I just decided to slur these last 2/16 notes here, because that is something that is existing throughout the entirety of this piece. We have the 8th note going to the tied 16th notes, or the tied 16th notes going to the 8th note. So we kept that, and then I thought, well, let me just go above that. And in my mind, I thought, I really just want to slur all these notes together and then leave the quarter note by itself. And I thought about a few different options and kind of looked at what was going on here with everything, and this actually seemed like the best option. And off the bat, it's what I actually wanted to do. Again, everything is preparing us for that up bow on the last note, where we have the down bow again on the next measure. And before we move on the next measure, you'll see that I just kept the violin 2 exactly the same. So after adding that similar familiar slur there in that 16th note, then I just analyzed everything how it was and saw that we have a down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, perfectly leading us to a down bow in the next measure. And how everything is, I actually like these 16th notes not having a slur or anything, since the first one is already being tied to. I'm just going to leave these how they are. It'll help it stick out more, and we do have the 8th notes not slurred at the same time. Furthermore, above that, we just have a single quarter note. So everything is existing as its own note duration already. We go into the next measure, we see the cello line just has the 3 beats of 16th notes. See, I chose to do something very simple. I kept the outside grouping of 4 16th notes with no slurs, and I kept the middle 4 16th notes beat 2 as a grouping of 2 slurred notes. This corresponds, of course, to what is above it. In violin 2, above the completely non-slurred 16th notes, we have an 8th note going to the tied 16th notes. So the 8th note's already a different note duration, and then the 16th notes are the same, but these are tied and these are not. Furthermore, they're traveling in contrary motion to each other. Above these last 2 16th notes, we see the entry of violin 1, where these are also slurred because it's keeping with that same pattern that we had the whole time, but these are traveling in contrary motion, and I would rather keep these both slurred, keeping the bowing scheme that I had the entire time. Everything also works out how it is. I like how everything works out. I would rather do this than unslur one of these groupings of 16th notes to try to make it stick out more than the other one. They're going to stick out just fine already, and whatever it is, they're going to create nice harmony. When you're writing music, it's not just about hearing 3 voices the entire time, being able to focus on 3 voices the entire time. It's about hearing nice music, hearing beautiful moments. And sometimes in these beautiful moments, you're going to hear 2 instruments a lot more than another one. Sometimes you're going to hear all the instruments blending together to create a beautiful sound. So counterpoint helps us to create distinctive melodies. It doesn't mean that we need to shoot for creating distinctive melodies as our only pursuit of writing, though. The whole point of this is to help hear all of those melodies separately. But we still want to create beautiful moments. We still want to create harmony. And we still want to have togetherness in certain moments at least. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We're just trying to create good music here. Let's use these lessons and rules more as tools to help us achieve what we want to. Okay, but back into the bowing scheme, we see it's exactly the same as before. The intro to the theme has those 2 16th notes slurred, then we have those 2 8th notes not slurred, like I've been repeating from the 2 measures before. Then the last 2 8th notes are slurred at the same time, while violin 2 has 2 8th notes not being slurred below it, while at the same time the cello has 4/16 notes not being slurred below that. So those being different note durations and not being slurred stick out a lot on their own. The one thing to note is that I put a down bow mark here in the next measure. That's because I wanted to keep this measure how it was. I didn't want to change the bowing of it, and I also wanted a down bow on the next beat. I have that throughout this entire thing, and it's a pretty short section here, so I'm sticking with that. I don't just randomly want to have an up bow when throughout the entire piece on every single measure I had a down bow on every single first beat of each measure. Therefore, if we follow violin 2 in this second measure here on the second line, we see it starts, of course, on the down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow, and down bow. So it ends on the down bow, which means it would start on an up bow without further information. So I just added a down bow marking so that the player knows it's a down bow. Furthermore, it's just 2/16 notes being slurred together, and then after that it goes to the next direction of bowing. Plus it has an 8th note rest before that, so the player has a little bit of time to possibly reposition their bow a little bit higher before that next down bow. But if anything, they probably wouldn't need to do that at all, because we only had a single 8th note on the down bow before. So we just have a down bow on this 8th note, and then a down bow on these 2/16 notes, and any player will be able to do that even at a very slow speed. So that's no problem at all with the ability of the player. And realistically, the player probably wouldn't need to adjust their bow at all. And then we notice we have the intro of the theme and then the beginning 4/8 notes of the theme again, and we have the same bowing scheme to where you have the 16th notes slurred, 2/8 notes not slurred, and then the last 2/8 notes slurred, where it's jumping up that 5th to that altered note of the new key that we're going to be in. Below all this, the cello just has a single quarter note in the beginning, so that's different in note duration compared to everything else. It's really going to stick out on its own, especially compared to a rest in the violin 2 for an 8th note, and then coming in with 2/16 notes in the middle of that. And then above that, we just have 4/16 notes in violin 1. Furthermore, we see violin 2 has those 2/16 notes slurred together, and if we think about that metrically above that in violin 1, we see those 2/16 notes are not slurred. They're also traveling in the same direction with the same movement of a step, so it's going to strengthen their independence as a line, help you hear both of those notes clearly. After this, we just have 2 rests in the cello. So now we're just looking at both the violins. We see violin 2 has 2/8 notes not being slurred, and above that we have a row of 16th notes traveling in stepwise motion that are not slurred as well. And we see that these are traveling in contrary motion away from each other. As violin 2 goes down with the 8th notes of a leap, violin 1 steps up with a row of 16th notes. So those are their own note durations and traveling in contrary motion. Then we go into the next beat. We see violin 2 has a leap of a 5th, where we have 2/8 notes being slurred, and it is an ascending leap of a 5th. Above that, in the violin 1, we see 16th notes descending melodically a 5th with 3 steps and then a leap of a 3rd at the end. The first 3/16 notes are tied, the last one isn't tied, adding to the symmetry of this measure here. And also being borrowed from before, we have this exact bow scheme happening before, to where here we see the same exact bow scheme. What is happening above and below, it's not exactly the same corresponding to it, other than the fact that we do actually have that quarter note in the beginning, but it's just the fact that we have these 3 beats consisting of all 16th notes, and we chose to reuse the same bowing scheme where that happened in a different measure before. So you see how a lot of this stuff in music, just like doing counterpoint, marking bowings, it has a similar theme to it, to where you're following a certain structure, you're making a certain structure, and you're kind of breaking free from that, or leading up to expectations and leading away from that, or varying things, and with that variation, then maybe that takes you somewhere else. But whatever it is, when you're scoring music, when you're writing bowings, you're in a similar mindset to an extent where you're not staying exactly strict and saying, oh, I have to do the exact things in the exact same areas that I did before, but instead we're just reusing things. And when we see similar amounts of notes, we're doing things from before and maybe even borrowing different things from before and combining it. But if we are combining it, we're probably reusing that and making that a new rhythmic theme. Okay, so whatever it is, we're trying to add all these little details to just add a little more interest and try to spice things up a little bit, all while keeping with familiarity, which familiarity is one of the basic things of a lot of music, where you have in rock music a familiar beat with the drums, or sometimes in classical music you have a familiar arpeggiation of notes occurring as a texture or an accompaniment. So don't be afraid of making things familiar and repeating things and having things that are similar from what you had before. If you really start dissecting some of your favorite musical pieces and your favorite songs, you're probably going to find, just like me and many others, that a lot of or some of our favorite songs are very often repeating certain things. Okay, so I don't want to get too sidetracked or anything. I just want to add some good useful stuff in these videos. Moving on to the next line though, the last line, let's look at how I slurred everything. So we see an 8th note rest in the cello, and then 2 16th notes being slurred, and where that's occurring is the beginning of the theme, so we're recycling everything from before. Entry slurred, then those 2 8th notes are not slurred, and then after that we have the leap of the 5th slurred. So with things like that, I would mark that first because I want to repeat that, and then I would respond to whatever else is above that accordingly. I also look above that, I see this grouping of 8th note and 16th notes. I know that every single time in the past that I saw this, then I would slur these 16th notes, so I did that right off the bat in the beginning. And since the cello line is just exactly what I scored before, I know the bowing is already going to work out fine. I could recheck it, down, up, and then also violin 1 is just a variation rhythmically of what we had before. We have many measures where we have these 8th note, 16th note pairs with an 8th note existing in there as well. And if we actually look at the first time this happened, we're basically doing a reverse of the first time. The first time we had the 8th note, 16th note grouping twice, and then the 8th notes. Now we just have the 8th note and the 2 16th note groupings after that. So it's all very familiar, and this is how it was written, but it's also slurred the same way as it would have been before, but now flipped. Now this is interesting because I said, okay, down below we have these 3 beats of pure 16th notes. So what am I going to do to slur this? Well, before I'm oftentimes choosing something symmetrical to where something is existing on both sides of that. I kept that pattern throughout every time that we've seen 3 16th notes so far. But when I looked above this, I saw that what was above it was almost so off symmetrical that I thought I would correspond to that in the opposite fashion with these 16th notes. So if we look at the violin 1, we see we just have 8th notes in the beginning, but then we have these grouping of 8th note and 16th notes both occurring at the end, and the 16th notes are paired together to where you have those 4 16th notes all kind of making a run there. So with that, it's off symmetrically, and I'm thinking there's some more symmetry happening at this last 2/3. So this last 2/3 section here, we see symmetry. So I corresponded with that in violin 2, and then I had these first 2 bars, so the first 2/3 of this measure, slurred with the first 3 16th notes, and then after that, the last one not. So it's not exactly symmetrical, but it kept with the theme that these first 2 beats of this measure have a mixture of slur and not slur, and then the last beat has no slur, and the opposite thing happens above it. Okay, now moving on to the second to last measure. We have the Neapolitan chord, and as this was written, the top line was already written in, and this was leading up to the ending, and these half notes were added kind of for harmonic support. So the 16th notes are already going to stick out enough on their own, but I slurred them just to make it kind of nicer of a line, and then I added some symmetry to where the 16th notes on either side are slurred, and then the 8th notes in the middle are not slurred, which is borrowing some ideas and mixing them from things that we've already seen throughout the entirety of this little piece. So having completely different note durations, the violin 1 is sort of making a little bit of a solo entrance here, while the cello and violin 2 are just holding out these half notes. But then the cello and violin 2 come back in on the last beat with these 2 8th notes, where you also have violin 1 playing the 16th notes, and everything is slurred. And okay, maybe you're thinking maybe I should unslur some things or change the slurring to try to make this stick out more like I've been doing previously throughout this whole thing. But I think that's unnecessary. This is a cadence, and the whole point of this is to make a nice ending. So I think to not take away from that and to make it a nice, smooth ending, I actually do want all of these slurred, even if it might take away from the voice independence, especially probably of this middle line here. It's all just going to make it a nicer cadence and a nicer harmonic ending. Okay, now that everything is slurred, let's give it a listen. Okay, now here's without the slurs so you can hear them back to back. Okay, so I think the slurs really help this out a lot. Right off the bat, visually, you can see it almost adds some more structure to the piece, but then listening to it, it also seems to add some more structure in the piece with the different bowing schemes and the familiar slurs. Of course, when you look at the piece after doing all these slurs, it also looks a little more professional and all, but that has all to do with the fact that that is because you're telling the players how to play, just like a lot of other people who would be writing for these instruments would do. So there's a purpose for why you're doing these slurs. You're not just wanting to sound a certain way, but you are thinking about, okay, I want it to sound a certain way, but it's through the context of doing the up bows and the down bows. And I think it just had a nicer ending product, especially with the lines being slurred and not slurred for certain reasons. I think you can kind of hear some of that, especially with the notes being slurred and not slurred for different reasons and purposes. I think as an end product, you can kind of hear that purpose in it of the slurs. Okay, now we slurred the notes. This is now telling the player that when they go from one note to the next note, how we want them to play it. But for now, they're just playing everything at one volume. So now we want to tell the players how loudly or how quietly to play certain sections. Okay, so we need to keep in mind of some things. One would be the environment that we're scoring in. This is just a chamber ensemble. In fact, it's a trio. It's just 3 instruments, so we want to keep that in mind. And then also the nature of the piece. For me, the beginning of it, just starting in one instrument, seems like it'd be a good idea to start it quiet. Okay, so here's what I did with the tempo changes. As we can see, I started off in pianissimo, then I put it in piano where the intro to the theme in the second violin happens. I kept it in piano there because I thought it sounded really nice. Then where it got into the section on the next page where we start having a lot of variations of a lot of things, then I started making it go louder, did a crescendo to mezzo piano, another crescendo to mezzo forte, and then furthermore a crescendo to forte, just slowly making its way to forte. The middle grounds are just to smoothly get us there. If I just had a big hairpin going all the way to forte, it wouldn't sound good. It wouldn't even really sound good if I went quite to mezzo forte, being in piano in a chamber ensemble here. Mezzo dynamics become less useful once you have a bigger ensemble like an orchestra, but they can still be useful for things like this when you want to build up to a certain dynamic smoothly. And especially here in a chamber ensemble, you really want to do that. So here I am in forte, and then I just kept it in forte for the rest of it. The only thing is I altered one thing. I changed where this was a 16th note going up to an A flat. Instead, I just kept it a G, and that's the same note as the note before. So you kind of hear this G, and then it goes to here, but they're not actually tied. This is twice as long though. So it just serves as a little bit of a high point where you have a little bit of a pause before you go back down for that violin 1 there. Just my little alteration. I like the way it sounded. So now that I added the dynamics, let's give it a listen. Okay, so there's that. I think the dynamics really helped actually give it a lot more character. We started pretty soft, we got a little bit louder, and especially with the instruments combining, it just makes it louder already. So it gets a little bit louder and a little bit louder, especially because we hear now 3 instruments, and then from there it just slowly gets up to a peak loudness to where we kind of have everything that was happening now varied, a lot more interesting, a lot more movement, and then it all leads up to a slower finish. You have the short little violin solo phrase there, and then everything reaches the cadential ending. Okay, so now we did the slurs, telling the players when they go from one note to the next note what to do. Now we have dynamics. Now we're telling the players how loud to play and when. But now if we want to communicate with the players more of how we want them to actually play certain notes, well, we could add the accents or articulations. However, in this case, I think this fits perfectly without the articulations, without the accents. I think that would be unnecessary for the style of the piece it is. It's sort of a Baroque piece. With that, it might be more appropriate to add a trill somewhere, something like that, or a mordant. But we already have a good amount of movement and passing tones, so all of that seems sort of unnecessary. I would say it's good enough how it is right now. So now what else could we do? I mentioned it is in lento right now, the tempo. What MuseScore is showing me is the quarter note has 50 beats, so 50 beats per minute, because we're in 3/4 time here, so each of the quarter notes is a beat here. So I was mentioning I was going to do different tempos, so now we'll look at it in adagio, and then after that we'll try andante, and then we'll try allegro. But before we get into the tempo changes, we'll see that I changed something here, and that's at the end. I added a retardando. So this is going to slow it down to half speed before that final cadence. It's not just going to go full speed to half speed, but it's going to go from full speed and it's going to merge slowly into half speed to then where the last note is going to be at half speed. So let's give that a listen from the second to last line and hear the effect that this has. Then I'll put it in the different tempos. Okay, so these little things in my eyes are just making it sound more legitimate as an actual music piece, even though it was a pedagogical piece and it is pretty simple. Well, doing all these little things are just making it more musical. Okay, now let's give it a listen in adagio. Okay, so that was definitely fast enough for me. I actually like it how it was before, a little slower, but I'll do what I promised. So now from adagio, let's try it in andante. Okay, so that was pretty ridiculous. You definitely don't want it that quick. What this is kind of proving is it's not always good just to put everything super quick. I mean, of course, we already have 16th notes and 8th notes here, so that might already be obvious, but if that wasn't to you, now it's coming kind of apparent that there's a lot of things going on here. And one of the things is, even in the MuseScore playback, you don't hear a lot of projection in the instruments because the instruments are playing such short note durations that they don't have a time to really project the note that they're playing, and the whole thing kind of has this sound to it that's a little too soft to pick up on what the instruments are actually doing and to follow everything properly, because it's also kind of going all over the place. If you did give this to real players, it probably would sound a lot different than this playback, but it's showing you that this passage that's written here with these 16th note and 8th note bass, it is not something that really fits in a fast tempo. Okay, now buckle up, we're going to listen to it in allegro. Okay, so as you can see, not very nice at all. Kind of crazy. And since this passage has a lot of moments of harmony and a lot of it is built off chords, you don't really get a chance to hear those nice harmonic moments and those chords being expressed. You're not really making out the chords. If you did have a solo melodic line that was written for this purpose of being really fast, well, maybe you could have it this fast if it was having a certain direction to it and it was well planned out. But you see something like this where you have three voice counterpoint, you're trying to follow it, you're trying to have these nice harmonic moments, you're trying to actually follow everything and appreciate it. Well, you kind of lose all that when you make it go super fast. And a lot of people have this misconception that classical music should be played as fast as possible, especially if you think about piano pieces. Literally just as fast as humanly possible, and that gives it the classical essence or something. I don't know if that's what people think, but I see people playing these pieces so incredibly fast, and you kind of lose some of the magic that's in there when you listen to it slower, and you get to kind of sit there and actually appreciate it. Like if you've ever driven your car somewhere many times in your life, and you never really thought much of it, and then you go on a walk in the same place, and you actually start looking around and appreciating everything, and you start saying, wow, now that I'm actually going slower, I can take everything in more, I can look around and appreciate all the small details of what's around me. Well, I would say that it's similar when you're writing music. You want to be able to appreciate it, so the tempo really makes a huge difference. Personally for me, I think it's good just here in lento. So if you want to hear it one more time here in lento with the final ending with the ritardando, I'll play it one more time for you. Okay, there it is. Now that it's a lot slower, you probably noticed you can actually hear the melodies a lot more. And then when it gets in the counterpoint where you hear the separate melodies, now you can hear each one and follow them a lot more. You might also notice that when you try following each melody in its entirety, there's certain moments where the instrument will kind of blend and it'll add more of a texture and a harmonic support, and you won't really hear it stick out as much. But when you listen to the entirety of it, you can definitely hear three instruments. And what I mostly hear for me is two instruments harmonizing together and then a bass instrument. And well, that's because that is exactly what's happening here. But what helps with that is the placement of the notes. A lot of times when the violin 2 and the violin 1 will be creating, let's say, a third or a sixth, they're going to be within that octave, within that closed position of that third or sixth, which means they're going to be stacked right on top of each other, and they're not going to be spaced out an extra octave or anything like that. But on the other hand, when you see the bass clef and what's above it is going to be violin 2, because there aren't voice crossings here, each voice stays in its own register, so the middle instrument stays in that middle voice. But you'll notice that when these are creating, let's say, a third or a sixth or something like that, they're not going to be within that closed position within that octave. For example, the first note here, we see a C. In the bass clef, we see an E in the treble clef. If you think of a C and an E stacked within the octave, well, the E would just be right above the C, but in fact, it is an octave away from that here in the treble clef. If we look above this in the treble clef, we see there's again a C above this E, but in fact it's within that closed position. It's right a sixth above it. It's not an octave and a sixth above it like you would see in the bass. Okay, so that helps with the bass being independent as a bass voice, and then the top two instruments harmonizing together, but then there is a togetherness to everything as well, and the distance between the instruments plays a big role in that. We do see in certain moments things do get rather close to each other, like here we only have things a fifth apart, but that's not a problem. You just probably wouldn't want to stay a fifth apart between these voices throughout the entire thing, and we can see that it doesn't do that. But there's actually a lot of interest in here within the register, and then the modulations, different rhythms, and a lot of things. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. There's going to be a lot more videos like this. This one's pretty simple. We're going to have some more complex things. We're going to learn how to write simple fugue, and then we're going to build up from there. We'll put the things like fugue in things like violin or in stringed instruments, and learn and challenge ourselves to things like writing a solo violin fugue, which will help us in many ways, help us think about the violin a lot more when writing, the strings, the positions, but then think about fugue also limited furthermore through a certain instrument and what it can play, making things more realistic, because you're not probably just wanting to write a bunch of piano fugues, but maybe you do, I don't know. Whatever it is, it'd be good to be able to write for that instrument and probably multiple instruments. So you'll see a lot of stuff like that coming up, especially around chamber music, starting with just the string family in the beginning. Stay tuned, and until next time, take care. Goodbye.